This is a special presentation from CBC News.
That's going to mean new days and new hopes and better tomorrows for all Canadians.
From a working-class family in rural Quebec, the Right Honourable Brian Mulroney would go on to be one of the most consequential prime ministers in the nation's history.
Anybody who says anything to the contrary can bloody well put his seat on the line.
He set out to do big things: establish free trade, fight apartheid, protect the environment, enshrine national unity.
We are at a critical juncture in our history.
He dedicated his life to this country.
All I'm concerned about is making certain that Canada turns out to have been on the right side of history.
And between record-breaking electoral highs and reputation-smearing political lows, Mulroney carved out a legacy that would change a nation.
I happen to believe that once you...
Mr. Turner, just 1 second.
Once any
you
nation...
do not have a monopoly on patriotism.
But beyond what's in the history books, Mulroney is remembered so often for his humanity as a husband, father, and grandfather, as a friend, an advisor, and confidant. Today, the goodbyes begin. Prime Minister Brian Mulroney lies in state. Good morning. You are looking at the Sir John A. Macdonald building that is in downtown Ottawa on Wellington Street, just across from Parliament Hill, across from the West Block, which is where the House of Commons is. Of course, that building named for the first Prime Minister of this country. And this will be where soon the 18th Prime Minister will lie in state. So Canadians, dignitaries, can begin to pay their respects and say goodbye. Hello there, I'm Rosemary Barton, and over the next few hours we will see something quite extraordinary, the beginning of the official farewells to the Right Honourable Brian Mulroney, the beginning of his line in state. Our eyes and ears on that scene today. Host of the House, Catherine Cullen, she will be there as the dignitaries make their way in, and the Parliamentary Bureau's David Thurton, who will be trying to speak with members of the public who may be gathering as well, and we'll bring them both in a moment. Of course, this is sort of the beginning, as I said, of a week of tributes to the former Prime Minister, and helping us with our special coverage this morning, the host of Power and Politics, David Cochrane. Good to see you, David.
Hey, Rosie.
What are you thinking about on this this important day for Brian Mulroney, for the country, for his family?
Well, we're going to see something today that we haven't seen in nearly a quarter of a century, and it's the first Prime Minister lying in state since former Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau passed away in 2020. We have had state funerals in recent years, most recently, of course, Ed Broadbent, the former NDP leader. We've seen them for Jack Layton, Conservative Finance Minister Jim Flaherty, and there was a state funeral of a different kind for Prime Minister John Turner, who we saw there going up against Brian Mulroney in 1984. But he passed away in September of 2020, so in the middle of COVID, so a far more intimate, less public affair. So what we're going to see today is a much more public event as the country begins this week of saying goodbye to a Prime Minister of real consequence, Rosie, as you said there in the opening. But all of this, too, we have to keep in mind, is that this is all part of a very personal process of a family saying goodbye to a husband, to a father, to a grandfather, and anyone who's ever lost anybody knows this is normally a very intimate process. But because Brian Mulroney lived his life in this very public way, and his family shared him with the Canadian public for so many years, it seems appropriate in a way that that personal will mingle with the public today and throughout the course of this week, as it really did throughout Brian Mulroney's life. Yeah, and that the family will be, as it was yesterday inside the House of Commons, highlighted as well, because the family was really central to much of what he did, much of his legacy, and certainly his wife of more than 50 years, Mila Mulroney, his partner through all of it. Catherine Cullen is outside the Sir John A. Macdonald building, as I said, where dignitaries are going to arrive in the next hour or so, and visitation will begin. Catherine.
where the Mulroney family, Rosie, will be hearing both expressions of condolences and sympathies, but also undoubtedly many personal recollections of Brian Mulroney. What we've been hearing since the former Prime Minister passed is that so many people from all walks of life have a story of connection with Brian Mulroney, and some of them will get to share those stories today with the Mulroney family. In about half an hour's time, the funeral cortege will arrive at the Sir John A. Macdonald building. The Mulroney family will emerge, as will the casket draped in the flag of Canada. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police Bearers Party will be bringing it into the Sir John A. Macdonald building. And at that moment, for about 15 minutes, all the cameras inside the building will be turned off. The Mulroney family will have another quiet, private moment of reflection. In about an hour's time, dignitaries will start and come to express those condolences. The Prime Minister, the Governor General. We'll be seeing former Governors General Adrian Clarkson, David Johnston, former Prime Minister Joe Clark, members of the Cabinet, members of the Senate, the Mayor of Ottawa, Mark Sutcliffe, the head of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. For about 2 hours this morning, those dignitaries, ambassadors as well, will be coming and expressing those condolences, those remembrances. And then in the afternoon, it will be members of the public who are welcome to come express those feelings to the family, sign the Book of Commemoration. And really, that does reflect so much of what we've been hearing about Brian Mulroney, his interaction with everyone from the worker on the shop floor to heads of state, and how that was a defining characteristic in many ways of his life.
Yeah, it's sort of it also speaks to who he is, where he came from, as we highlighted a little bit in the opening. Catherine, thank you for that. We'll come back to you if there's guests and throughout, of course, the coverage. And as we were saying, this is really the beginning of a week of events to honor the former Prime Minister. Today, dignitaries, the Prime Minister, as Catherine said, for instance, and then the general public will be allowed to pay their respects to the Prime Minister here in Ottawa. The line in state will continue here in the nation's capital tomorrow, and then the casket will be transported to Montreal. And there, Brian Mulroney will be lying in repose, and that will be held at St. Patrick's Basilica, and people will be able to visit there from Thursday and Friday in Montreal, in the former Prime Minister's home province, and of course Montreal, where he has a family home and lived for so long. And then on Saturday, the casket will travel in a procession through the streets of Montreal to Notre Dame Cathedral for the state funeral of Brian Mulroney. That begins at 11 Eastern, the official part of that, although our special coverage will begin at 9 a.m. Eastern, because as you can well imagine, there will be many, many guests and many dignitaries who will want to pay tribute to the former Prime Minister. I should also say that the Prime Minister Mulroney is lying in state at the John A. Macdonald building, of course, because Parliament, the House of Commons centre block is under extensive renovation. And so while Pierre Elliott Trudeau and Jack Layton were lying in state in the middle of centre block, Brian Mulroney is in the building named for the first Prime Minister. So that's why things look a little bit different here today. Let's bring in our David Thurton, who is covering the Canadians who will want to pay tribute to the former Prime Minister. Won't start right away, but David is there for when it does begin. David.
Hey, Rosie. Yeah, I was speaking with the MP for this area, Yasin Akvi, yesterday, and he's been getting a number of questions from constituents and other people asking when they can come to pay their respects to the former Prime Minister. And we are expecting crowds, and he's expecting crowds to show up here to pay their tributes to honor the Prime Minister. It will be open to the public around just after lunchtime, 12:30, where people will be able to pay their tributes. They'll have to go through security, and we're seeing over my shoulder here, or just beyond me, a lot of barriers that have been set up. And people, when they come here later today, will have to go through a labyrinth of these barriers, go through security eventually, and then they will get to pay their respects. Starting at 12:30, ending at 6 p.m. Tonight. As Catherine mentioned, there will be a condolence book as well, where people will be able to sign. And there's also one online where Canadians, if they can't make it here in person, can also pay their respects.
Okay, David, thank you for that. We'll come back to you as we start to see people gather. It is early here in Ottawa yet, of course, and as David said, the public part of this does not open for a number of hours so that dignitaries can make their way in. And as David also mentioned, that Book of Condolence will be set up for people to sign here in Ottawa, and there is an online version as well. But if you have a story about Brian Mulroney and gosh knows that since Mr. Mulroney passed away, we've heard a lot of stories from a lot of different people. I myself have had some of you email me your stories about meeting him, your feelings about him, and they weren't always as what you would expect. You all have different feelings about the former Prime Minister. But if you want to share it with us, please email. You can email us ask@cbc.ca. While I like the emails myself, it is better to email ask@cbc.ca, where we can make sure that we see them and can pay tribute to Brian Mulroney today, but over the next number of days, because you're going to see a lot of familiar faces, a cast of characters and politicians from times gone by that you will hear more from over the next number of days as the country mourns Brian Mulroney, pays tribute to him, and thinks about his legacy and what he did for this country. Of course, some of that got underway, as I said, yesterday inside the House of Commons, and David Cochrane, you were covering all that yesterday. And that was really the beginning of the week in some ways, and certainly where we first saw the family gathered to hear some of those many kind words for their father and husband. Yeah, it was interesting. We saw all of the leaders, obviously all of the party leaders, give tributes to former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, beginning with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. And as you looked at it, Rosie, it was interesting that none of them were old enough to vote when Brian Mulroney was actually running to be Prime Minister, with the exception of Elizabeth May, who worked for him as an environmental policy advisor, worked for his environment minister in 1986 to 1988. And she was the most emotional and personal and affected person, I think, in the House of Commons yesterday. She had to rise to ask for permission to speak because the Green Party does not have official party status. So she needed unanimous consent. And she said, "I love the Prime Minister so much, it's going to kill me not to be able to say it out loud." And in one of those rare moments of nonpartisanship in Parliament, they gave her permission. And she talked about Mulroney as a Green Prime Minister, as a champion of fighting climate change. She said he literally saved all life on the planet with the Montreal Protocol, and the efforts to work towards reversing the damage to the ozone layer, and pointed out that he was a guy who didn't just stand up to his opponents, he stood up to his friends, which I think is an interesting point to make, that, dealing with Ronald Reagan, who he had a good friendship with and was a close ally with on things like acid rain, dealing with Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom at the time, on apartheid and South Africa, and using the Commonwealth to squeeze that country, to change its ways. That was the one that struck me, along with Louis Plamondon, who is the Dean of the House of Commons, a Bloc Québécois MP, was elected in 1984 as a progressive conservative with Brian Mulroney. And the Bloc, in some ways, is also part of Brian Mulroney's legacy. His efforts to try to, reconcile Quebec and Canada with the Constitution led to this splintering and the creation of that party. But he praised them, as a good Quebecer and as a good Canadian, and as a leader who was good for his home province and good for his country, which I felt was fitting given what we learned as Mr. Mulroney passed away, that him and Lucien Bouchard had started to reconcile in the months leading up to his death. And the family after did speak, his sons did speak a little bit and said how much they appreciated Elizabeth May's comments, actually, and they found them very, very touching. And we should also say that Prime Minister Trudeau is one of the speakers at the funeral in the same cathedral, the Notre Dame Basilica, where he also gave a eulogy for his own father that was really the beginning of his own political career. Let's go back, though, and look a little bit at some of those tributes from yesterday, as David said, many of them touching and paying fitting tribute to the former Prime Minister.
Mila, Caroline, Ben, Mark, Nicholas, you saw it up close, and you know how hard it can be. But on the big things, you also know full well he wouldn't let himself succumb to temporary pressure. He was motivated by service.
For Brian Mulroney, phone calls were like an art form. I've lost count of the number of people who've told me about the worst day in their lives. They might have lost a loved one or a friend or suffered a terrible public humiliation. And then suddenly the phone would ring. And it would be that mellifluous baritone on the other end of the line.
The problem is with this kind of resume, not only can you not pad it, you can't even list it and not run out of time. How did he do all this? Well, he had skills and talents. Being Irish, I can only suspect he actually physically once kissed the Blarney Stone. There's no real way to explain how he could charm the birds out of the trees, but he sure as heck could.
for us sitting up in the gallery and hearing everybody speak so positively, probably not what he was used to, but he would have loved it, and we did as well. And everybody kind of taking the time to think through and to say these positive words, we can't be more thankful. So thank you very much.
That was Mark Mulroney at the end there, the Prime Minister's third child, Ben and Nicholas, and of course Caroline Mulroney, now a cabinet minister in Doug Ford's government, will be also she'll be delivering the eulogy on Saturday. So we'll hear more, of course, about the family's thoughts from her directly. I'll bring in Catherine Cullen, who also was watching yesterday and listening closely to what was going on inside the House of Commons, because a lot of people, I think Catherine Cullen, want to, in moments like this, explain their connections to Brian Mulroney for political reasons too, and certainly he was generous in his advice to many different people and many different parties.
It was, Rosemary, certainly remarkable watching the Mulroney family, who was in the gallery for all of those speeches, and seeing, I thought, the moments that they reacted to, clearly appreciating, and we can see Greg Fergus, who's Speaker of the House of Commons, is just coming to the Sir John A. Macdonald building right now. He, along with the Speaker of the Senate, Raymond Gagné, and the Prime Minister will be greeting the Mulroney family when they arrive with the funeral cortege in a few minutes' time. But as I was saying, Rosie, it was striking to watch the Mulroney family, and quite moving, really, because as we have talked about, this is both a very public thing that is happening right now, these moments of sympathy, moments of reflection, but also the very personal and private grief of losing virtually a lifelong partner and a father. But watching the moments that they appreciated the most in the speeches, certainly, the whole room was paying rapt attention when Elizabeth May was speaking, because she was speaking so passionately. She began her speech talking about a recurring dream she used to have, where she would run up to Brian Mulroney and say, "Brian Mulroney, I love you," and sort of had everybody laughing. It was really quite lovely, and as you heard from Mark Mulroney there, a moment that clearly stood out to the family when the Prime Minister talked about his last meeting with Mr. Mulroney about a year and a half ago, I believe, and how they recollected on the challenges of political life. One moment where I saw the whole Mulroney family smile was when the Prime Minister talked about how everyone in politics liked to win, but Brian Mulroney really liked to win. Pierre Poilievre as well, who is friends with Mark Mulroney, gave a speech. I would note there were some moments in there that certainly had a slight partisan tinge to them, but when Mr. Poilievre talked about advice that he had received from Mr. Mulroney about how to handle the stresses of politics, and said, the secret wasn't meditation or yoga. Brian Mulroney's secret to dealing with the incredible stresses of political life was Mila. That, I think, was a very moving moment. Something that we have heard universally is the close bond that the two of them shared. As you said earlier, Rosie, more than 50 years of marriage. They were coming up on 52 years of marriage, and she a constant partner, a constant advisor to Brian Mulroney through what was a very, as you've said, consequential, but also very tumultuous political career.
Yeah, I think their marriage is something that hopefully we'll hear more about over the next week or so, because it was obviously a love affair, but it was also a very powerful political partnership. The number of times he would go to Mila Mulroney and ask for advice or get her take on something, because as is so often the case in political marriages and relationships, your partner becomes sort of your main person, right? Your main confidant, your main advisor, and certainly Mila Mulroney played that role in spades for her husband, and we will see her again today as the family arrives shortly to be there for the line in state. And as we said off the top, they will have a few moments once the casket gets there to be by themselves with the casket and to have a moment. Remember, Brian Mulroney did pass away in Florida. He has a home in Palm Beach, and so his body came back about a week or so ago, a week, 10 days ago. So they'll have a moment quietly by themselves before the doors open for dignitaries to come in and also pay respects. And as we also said, the public also has a chance to do that later today. And if you want to do that, there is an online book of condolence. And of course, you can also email us if you've got things to say about the former Prime Minister. One of the things that I was reflecting on a little bit, David, is the many lessons Brian Mulroney has for politicians today. One of the things that he really took very seriously, and this was, I think, in part because of what happened with Joe Clark before Brian Mulroney took over the leadership of the party, but his intent was to treat caucus as family. And I raise that because today is so intimate and about his own family and about talking about how people felt about him. But I think that went a long way to keeping those friendships that we've heard so much about in the past number of weeks going. And that is that it's not that he kept everyone happy necessarily, but he paid close attention to them and to that relationship. And that is something I think that other leaders struggle with, frankly.
Yeah, there's a couple of lessons when you talk to contemporary politicians about what they learned from Brian Mulroney, and a lot of them talk about that, certainly as contemporaries, and people who worked for him and with him, that in the best moments of your life, you'd get a call. In the worst moments of your life, you'd get a phone call. And it was a phone call because obviously it was a very different time. There was no texting and emailing back then. But it was that direct personal connection to get a phone call from the Prime Minister of the country to wish you a happy birthday or your spouse a happy birthday or to check in on a kid, and these sorts of moments that mattered. And you know, like any politician, Brian Mulroney's high water mark, it was 211 of about the 280 seats that existed in Parliament at the time. By 1993, it was a very different story, right? The longer you stay in politics and the more consequential things you try to do, the more you stress test your popularity with the public. But even then, people were with him because of that, right? The personal connection and the reaching out and the treating the caucus like family, as you said. I mean, that's one of the lessons. The other was something Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, I think, talked about yesterday, Rosie, in his tribute in Parliament, when he told a story of being at the Mulroney Institute at St. Francis Xavier University in Nova Scotia, his alma mater, and being in the replica of the PMO that's there, and speaking with Brian Mulroney about, being a Prime Minister, being a politician. I mean, and Justin Trudeau was around this his whole life, obviously, his father and now his role. And Mulroney said to him, the history is going to remember the big things, the big ticket items. And, that's the legacy of Brian Mulroney. When people talk about the big ticket items, the Montreal Protocol, acid rain, apartheid, free trade, the GST, as unpopular as it was, it is a pillar of the financial health of the country right now. And he was a guy who swung for the fences on things. And we talked about this on the night we learned of his passing. Some of those were hits and home runs, that stood the test of time. And others, for example, like his attempts to reconcile Quebec and the Constitution with Meech Lake and Charlottetown, had unintended consequences, such as Western alienation, the rise of the Reform Party, the creation of the Bloc Québécois. But the big ticket items was definitely, he was a big game hunter when it came to politics, and I think that's how he's going to be remembered over the course of this week.
He sure was, and those things, he didn't have to try again when it came to reconciling Quebec. He didn't have to try again with the Charlottetown Accord, and I would even suggest that perhaps much of the country didn't want him to try again, because indeed many Canadians had tired of that conversation by that point. But it was important to him to have that part of his legacy, and it was important to him, of course, as a Quebecer. We are, of course, standing by for the cortege, the funeral cortege, to arrive. Don't worry, we will not talk throughout all of this. There will be moments of silence as the casket arrives and as the family arrives. A difficult week for the family, too, I think, although I know that there are taking comfort in the many tributes that are being paid and the people showing up, and Canadians, all of you watching and sending your own messages, that is giving them a lot of comfort through a difficult week. A family that has lived very publicly, children obviously living in the public eye through much of their childhood, and even being included in a lot of the Prime Minister's work, being taken to G7 meetings and François Mitterrand's summer home and other things that I'm sure they're thinking about on this day as well, because that was part of their life. And his job, while important to him, was also part of their life that they had to be a part of and understand that very well. Catherine is outside the John A. Macdonald building there as we are standing by. Catherine?
Rosie, when you talk about the family, one story that's been striking that has emerged a few times since Brian Mulroney's passing is the Mulroney children, Mark Mulroney in particular, talking about how he always felt he could call his father, and it's only later that he realized that sometimes he was interrupting cabinet meetings or even perhaps a meeting of a G7. But that the father was always there for him, which I thought was a beautiful sort of human moment. Another striking testimonial, I guess, something that we heard yesterday from the Prime Minister, I thought had to do with what he said about Brian Mulroney's help around free trade and NAFTA when that was being renegotiated with Donald Trump. And he talked specifically about the significance of having Brian Mulroney vouch for a Liberal Prime Minister of Canada with, some Republican counterparts in the United States who might have otherwise not been so willing to speak to him. And I do think, particularly when you think about the complex, let's call it, relationship between the Mulroney and Trudeau families over the years, obviously Brian Mulroney had some very strong feelings about Justin Trudeau's father. The way in which Brian Mulroney advised Justin Trudeau on something that was ultimately, of course, such an important part of Brian Mulroney's legacy. And I do think the story of free trade in particular is a striking one that tells us so much about him. Brian Mulroney, of course, not initially in favor of free trade. His mind was brought around to it, and it is one of the defining parts of his legacy. So divisive at the time, an election fought over it, and people really feeling like this was something that might betray Canada. And now, as Mr. Mulroney himself was happy to point out in the last few years, there is virtual political consensus in this country. You don't see that kind of division anymore. It has come to be, the way things are in the country, and not only the way things are, but something that was very much worth fighting for and defending as NAFTA was renegotiated with Donald Trump.
Yeah, I think that's an important point there, Catherine, that at the beginning there was a lot of reticence around the idea of free trade, including from Mulroney, who I think had some famous quote about lying in bed with an elephant and then the elephant rolls over on you, and then the elephant in that case would be the United States. But he too came around to the idea that globalization and the direction of the world required Canada to have some sort of agreement where it was working in partnership with the United States, and that was not easy to negotiate the first time. And the fact that he was there and understood the importance of that the second time round, and again was able to use, and David, I'll bring you in here, was able to use his personal relationships to help the country, because that is very much what happened with Ronald Reagan. Again, he was sometimes criticized for being too close to Reagan, and in spite of that criticism, and in spite of people worried about how that would impact Canada, our reputation, our sense of culture and identity, he seemed to understand something that the rest of us kind of caught up to.
Well, and it was those relationships that helped him accomplish some of the big things that are part of his legacy. Like, does the acid rain treaty happen if he's not as able to get along with Ronald Reagan as he was, was able to forge that personal relationship. And then, flash forward to the more contemporary challenges. Donald Trump and Ronald Reagan were very different presidents, but Brian Mulroney was friends with both of them.
Yes.
And the ability to maintain a relationship with such divergent people, as Elizabeth May said, he had skills. That is quite the political skill. And to be a bridge between Trump's administration and Justin Trudeau's Liberal government, like as the Prime Minister said yesterday, he vouched for me with the GOP leadership and said you could trust this Liberal Prime Minister from Canada, and that helped them get a good deal for the country, on the renegotiation of NAFTA. And that sort of volatility represented by a guy like Trump, who's very transactional in the way he does politics, the relationships and that one-on-one, that really matters with a guy like that, and that was the value of Mulroney, in addition to his wisdom and experience and understanding of it from the original negotiations. But it is a rare thing to see someone retired from politics who left under difficult circumstances to respond to the call. Right? To be so committed to the public service and public good of the country, to come back to play such a significant role. And, it is a good thing to see the current generation of leadership tap into that previous generation of leadership on the big moments and not let ego and partisan stripe get in the way.
Yeah, especially when Mr. Mulroney understood that he was doing that. I mean, sure, to help a Liberal Prime Minister, but also for the good of the country. I mean, that's what was at stake here in that case. And of course, we'll talk more about Brian Mulroney's legacy over the next number of days, the good and the bad, because like anyone, it wasn't all it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows, as they say. There were difficult moments for him, and certainly moments where he had to come back and rebuild his own reputation with the public, which I think you are seeing over the past number of days, and you will continue to see. He did have some success with that people came to understand him a bit better, and I think he came to understand the country better as well. As I said, we are standing by. This is the front door of the John A. Macdonald building, which is on Wellington Street, just across from Parliament Hill, across from West Block, where the House of Commons is right now. Because, of course, of the extensive renovation going on in Centre Block, which is normally where a former Prime Minister would lie in state. Instead, Brian Mulroney will be here at the John A. Macdonald building, lying in state for the next 2 days in the nation's capital. You can see there the Speaker of the House of Commons and the Speaker of the Senate waiting for the cortege and the family to arrive. As we've said, the casket will be brought inside the John A. Macdonald building. The family will take a few moments privately with the casket. There's the Prime Minister also there to greet the family. And then the dignitaries will go by the casket and pay their respects. The public can start doing that later today. I think it starts at around 1 o'clock, if I'm not mistaken, so people that want to line up there on Wellington can do that. And as David Thurton mentioned to us earlier, we'll have to go through some security and we'll be allowed into that building to pay their respects. There are lots of streets closed around downtown Ottawa in order to allow all of this to happen. And as we said, then Brian Mulroney will make his way to his longtime hometown of Montreal, where he spent really most of his business career, because of course he was a very successful businessman before and after politics, and he will lie in repose in Montreal for a couple of days before the funeral gets underway on Saturday. So we're standing by now just for the cortege to arrive in a couple of moments, as we do that, let me bring back Catherine Cullen, maybe to talk a little bit, Catherine, as we're waiting here, about his attachment to Quebec. Obviously, a young man from Baie-Comeau with a working class family. I believe Peter C. Newman called him Canada's first working class prime minister, although he quickly became something completely different. The first prime minister, first Mulroney to graduate from university, and then, as I said, went on for a successful career. But Quebec remained such a fundamental part of who he was.
That's right. I mean, that jaw-dropping bilingualism was hard to miss yesterday from all the Mulroney children as well. Brian Mulroney, you know, his desire to bring Quebec into the Constitution, his desire to see the country come together was one of the defining features of his time as Prime Minister, a battle that he fought again and again, although, as you've been discussing, Rosemary, not ultimately successfully with the failures of both Meech and Charlottetown, but one that he believed in deeply. And that is a recurring theme that we have heard about Brian Mulroney. You know, that ambition to do big things and that desire to be driven, certainly he would say, by principle. I had the occasion to talk to him for the House in October and spoke a little bit about what he hoped his legacy would be, what lessons he thought his political career, those very high highs, of course, you know, the biggest win we had seen by any party, that landslide victory when the Conservatives came into power, but leaving with those desperately low approval ratings. What were the lessons for future prime ministers? And he talked about the importance of basically sticking to your guns. He said, if you know what you're doing is right for Canada, if you believe that it is right for the country, then perhaps 20 or 30 years later, you know, history will reward you. People will come to see that you have made the right choices. I think there is quite a conversation to have about the impacts of the efforts around Charlottetown and Meech and what the ramifications have been in terms of, you know, any appetite in Canada for any kind of constitutional discussion at this time. But fundamentally, that desire to keep Canada together. Part of what caused his rift with Lucien Bouchard, certainly, as Bouchard left to form the Bloc Québécois, which was a deep betrayal. We talk about, you know, this being a day that is very much about the personal, a very personal betrayal for Brian Mulroney, who had been friends with Bouchard since their days at the Université Laval. You know, years and years of friendship. But again, on that personal note, I think very moving for a lot of people to see that the two men had reconciled just in the last 6 months or so, that they had had occasion to speak. And Bouchard talking about, you know, so many years of friendship that were unfortunately wasted, but how wonderful it was to come back together again.
Thank you for that, Catherine. I think the cortege is just arriving there behind you. It'll pull up in front of the John A. Macdonald building, as we said, and the family will be there as well. It's a heavy day, I would say, in Ottawa at moments like this, perhaps in contrast to some of the highly political and partisan moments we saw yesterday around a debate around the Middle East and that NDP motion. Sometimes moments like this sort of bring everybody back to earth and kind of ground them in the importance of what they're doing. Not that that was an important debate, but it became deeply partisan over the course of the day. And this is a moment to think about legacy and what everybody's doing here and the importance of these jobs and these roles. So as we said, this is just, as you can see, across the street from the West Block. And you will see through the day members of Parliament as well as cabinet ministers, of course, just cross the street to pay their respects and take a moment to say hello to the Mulroney family who will be sitting there with the casket and to pay their respects to the former Prime Minister. You can see there the family gathered on the left of your screen. Mila Mulroney, her daughter Caroline, and the three boys, and I believe one or two of their spouses are there as well. Here's Mark Mulroney just checking in on his mother. She said to her in French, "You're okay, Mom?"
For outward dress, 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 dress. Prepare for inward turn, turn. Press left. Dress. 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 Prepare to slow march. March. Ins. Outs. Ins. Outs. In. Everybody prepare to halt. Halt. Everybody turn. Turn. Prepare to lower. Lower. Air party on and top. Down the right turn, turn. Lead air party. Take post. Air party firing. Cut, punch, up, fight, up. Air parties, very slow march. March. Air party, prepare for inward turn, turn. Prepare to dress the casket, dress. 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 Prepare to hands, hands. Prepare to raise, raise. Prepare to inward hand, hand. Prepare to shoulder, shoulder. Prepare to slow march, march. Ins, outs, ins, outs, ins, outs, ins, outs, in. Inside, outside, inside, outside, in. Inside, outside, inside, outside, in. Prepare to halt. Halt. Prepare to move left. Dress. 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 Prepare to slow march. March. Ins. Outs. Ins. Outs.
Okay. And the Right Honourable Brian Mulroney has arrived in the John A. Macdonald building, and the family now will take a moment in private to be with him and with each other as they reflect and as he begins this 2 days of lying in state here in the nation's capital. You saw there Cabinet Minister Mélanie Joly arriving. Others will also be crossing the street to come over and pay their respects at the beginning here, as we wait for the doors to open to the public, to Canadians as well. But we will give the family their moment, and we'll come back to it as soon as they've done that. Meanwhile, Catherine Cullen is just outside the building, and she is with a Conservative MP who's going to make his way inside there as well. Catherine?
That's right, Rosemary. I've got Rick Perkins with me, a Conservative MP who was also a staffer during the Mulroney era. And in fact, Rick, you have this wonderful button on. You were telling me from 1983, eh?
Yeah, from the leadership in 1983. So when I first got involved, I was 19 years old, I think, when he ran for the leadership, when I first joined the party.
You came to join us just as we were watching the family arrive, and that was obviously a very emotional moment for you. What is foremost in your mind about Brian Mulroney today?
There's so many things rush through my head from the time when you're in your 20s and you're working up here, and for a person like him, it greatly affects the rest of your life. So thinking of all those stories, both the fun stuff and the policy issues that I got to play a little fringe role in and travel around the world occasionally with the Prime Minister, but also the personal things after, and the phone calls and what he cared about. And I've spoken to a lot of the former staffers over the last week or so in preparation for my speech in the House tonight. And one of the things that they've all talked about was how much he changed their lives personally, how they lived their lives today because of what they learned from him as a leader, but as a friend to even young staffers like us back then.
What was that for you? What was something that you took away that shaped your life?
Well, this is an odd business, politics, right? And if you become passionate about it and passionate about public service, one of the things that Brian Mulroney taught us was loyalty. We're in a group of people who believe they're doing good things for the country. Doesn't matter what political party you're in, and doesn't matter whether or not the public agrees that you're doing good things for the country. You feel this camaraderie in the sense of team, and he was loyal sometimes to a fault to his friends, to cabinet ministers, and to the point where it impacted occasionally his public reputation because of his loyalty. But that's the most important thing that I found too, that friendship and loyalty that's developed on this, and it's how I've lived my life both in work and at home. And for some of the us that saw him the way he was with his family, when we had families, we looked to how he managed his kids. That he'd be at a G7 summit in Munich and his family would be calling, the kids would be calling, and he would stop everything. Didn't matter that he was in a meeting with a president or prime minister to talk to his kids. It was the most important thing, and that's what a lot of us have kept in mind as we've grown older and got careers beyond politics before I got back in, and had families and friends, and we all still keep in touch quite regularly, and we actually have a little celebration tonight here in Ottawa. A lot of the former staffers are gathering.
It's a lovely tribute. You talk about those phone calls. Was there a particular phone call that you got that springs to mind?
Yeah, and most of the ones that come to my mind happened after we were out of government in '93. But 13 months ago, and I'll try and keep this together, but 13 months ago, my father passed away. And he called me from Florida. And he asked about my dad, the circumstances, the history of my dad, because that's what he always wanted to know about your family, about what people were interested and passionate about. And then he talked about his father and how important his father was to him growing up, an electrician in a small town who said, no, you're not going to work here in the pulp mill. You're going to get away and you're going to get an education, and sent him away in high school to New Brunswick. But his father was very important to him. And not only that, he lost him as well. So he talked about what life was like without your parents. And then at the end, he said, by the way, I'm having a few health issues. I've been battling prostate cancer. I almost didn't make it this winter, but I think we're good now, and we're looking forward to the years ahead. And after I hung up the phone, I thought, well, not only was that, you know, the lowest point in your life, right, is what he was so masterful at caring about, but he's dealing with his own health issues, his own life-threatening issues, and he's thinking about me and my father. And we heard that around from the NDP around the tributes that he did to Ed Broadbent during that time, and that he was doing those interviews from the hospital. I mean, it's that incredible caring for people, and that to me made him most effective, because the reason I believe he was able to get these transformational achievements done is because he actually cared and understood what the people he was dealing with cared most in life. And he's the only prime minister that spoke to a joint session of Congress, at the U.S. Congress. And in that, he did a quote. He said a quote, if you want to have a friend, you've got to be one. And to me, that sort of governed his life. He was always people's friends, helping them when they're down and not asking for anything in return.
Rick Perkins, our condolences, and thank you so much for this today. Rosemary?
Thanks, Catherine. That was lovely. I have the feeling Rick could have talked for a couple of hours there about his former boss and friend Brian Mulroney, and that is kind of what happens when you start sharing memories about Brian Mulroney. And it's kind of what happened when you got caught on the phone with him, too. Sometimes those calls went on an awful long time. But he did things like that, as Mr. Perkins said. He sometimes even called people's mums and dads. I've heard many stories since of politicians where he would just call their mum or dad to check in on them. Jean Charest being one of them who told us about that the week after Mr. Mulroney died. Lots of people have made their way into the building here as the family gathers themselves for a moment. The Governor General, the Minister of Finance, Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, Bill Blair, and others, and you will see them move past the casket and pay their greetings to the Mulroney family as well. But this day and the next few days are also about Canadians having a moment to pay tribute to the 18th Prime Minister of this country, and David Thurton is down there, and he has one of them by him.
Hey, Rosie, yeah, I have a family from Invermere, BC, and they didn't plan on coming here to pay their tributes to Brian Mulroney, but they happened to be in Ottawa on vacation, and with great luck are here to pay tribute and honor a Prime Minister that, Meredith, you're a big fan of, especially his environmental legacy.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a real privilege to have the opportunity to pay respects to someone who reminds us today that climate change and environment are not partisan issues. They're not conservative or liberal issues or, rifts to play for political advantage. These are matters of urgency, and statesman takes action based on science. And Brian Mulroney did that at great risk and to the benefit of Canadians and people everywhere. He was a decision maker, and an even-handed leader. I certainly, I might not say I was a huge fan of Brian Mulroney, but it's very powerful to have the opportunity to remember his stunning legacy. We were in the House yesterday, and Elizabeth May ran a list of his environmental champion, actions as environmental champion, and it was quite moving, very remarkable. Mm-hmm. I would take Brian Mulroney back today.
And your daughter, Virginia, you were listening to some of those speeches. What stood out to you, or what maybe spoke to you?
I just found it interesting that, I wasn't alive when he was Prime Minister, so I found it interesting all the things he had done and how much praise people had for him as Prime Minister.
Yeah. Okay, well. You know what? Thank you so much for joining us and talking with us. So, I mean, you happen to be in Ottawa, you happen to be in the House for those speeches, and you happen to be here at, the Lion State for the former Prime Minister. And you also saw the Deputy Prime Minister, Chrystia Freeland, walk by.
Yes.
And got to meet her, so that was pretty cool.
Well, and she had something very interesting to say about Prime Minister Mulroney, that he was the first Western leader to recognize an independent Ukraine, which I did not know, and is just another indication of his incredible statesmanship.
Okay, thank you so much for this. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts, and enjoy your time in Ottawa. Rosie, I'll send it back to you.
Thanks, David. Appreciate it. Great to hear from some Canadians who, as we say, not everyone left Mr. Mulroney, but people come to appreciate or have come to appreciate him and the many things that he did. As you can see, we are back now inside the room at the John A. Macdonald building, where the family is gathering to have dignitaries, the Prime Ministers and others, come in. Mila Mulroney, the 4 children, and I'm told that 2 of the spouses are there today, both Mark Mulroney's wife, Vanessa, and Caroline Mulroney and her husband, Andrew Lapman, is also there. So those are the people that will be greeting the dignitaries. Of course, the Mulroney family is large. There's lots of grandkids, and I'm sure we will see them eventually when we get to the funeral in Montreal. David, maybe I'll bring you back just for a moment before I'm hoping I can show a little bit of tape of the former Prime Minister's official photographer, who is also, I see, in the room. The family have asked him to come back and take pictures again, as he did for decades of their lives together. But I'll just get some thoughts from you there.
It's an interesting moment to watch the family, right? When you lose a parent, there's those moments of profound grief when it immediately happens, and then you get caught up in the propulsion of the ritual, of the preparing to say goodbye, of the wakes and of the public events, and that is just amplified to an unimaginable degree when you are the widow and the children of a former Prime Minister. Now, clearly, they're very used to spending life in the public eye. Caroline Mulroney, who's the president of the Treasury Board in the Ontario government right now, a politician herself. Ben Mulroney had a career on television. The other 2 boys, Nicholas and Mark, have gone more into private sector, investment banking and business, for example. But it is these moments where you are alone as a family for this moment of profound intimacy as you get ready to say goodbye, and then you have to pull it all back together. For this public moment where the head of state, Mary Simon, the Governor General, and her husband, Whit Fraser, are walking down a red carpet to pay tribute and say goodbye to your father.
Yeah, and we can certainly see some of the emotion on their face. This is when things, I think, start to hit very deeply. This is, of course, the Governor General and her husband, Whit Fraser, paying their respects to the children now. Ben on the left, Mark Mulroney on the right, and his wife there, Vanessa. And of course, there's all different kinds of state funerals and lying in state. The Mulroney family was deeply involved in the planning of this, working closely with the Department of Heritage and the Prime Minister's office to get things particularly right for their father, for their husband. And of course, Mr. Mulroney had thoughts too about what he wanted. For instance, the flowers in that room, I'm told, were organized by Mark Mulroney's wife, Vanessa. So everyone playing a different part in terms of how this and the next few days would unfold. To be sure to mark sort of the giant that was Brian Mulroney and the legacy of him. And so I think you'll see a lot of that in the way the days play out. It will be grand, it will be big, it will be important. David?
You know, Rosie, I did an interview with Mary Simon a few weeks back.
That's right, yeah.
About Brian Mulroney and her sense of his Indigenous legacy, something this Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, has certainly made a centerpiece of his political agenda. And well, I'll talk about that after.
Yeah,
he
we'll let
speaks to
him
the family.
speak to the family. We'll come back. Prime Minister, of course, someone who knows a lot about these kinds of events. As his own father, had a state funeral, a line in state that was very significant obviously for him, but also for the country. There was thousands of people turned out for that, and it marked very much his eulogy, the beginning of Justin Trudeau's sort of political career. And here we are more than 20 years later as he is Prime Minister. And as you saw, greeting Mila Mulroney in particular very personally, because it was a deep connection that he made to the former Prime Minister. They became friends, and Mr. Mulroney offered lots of advice to Justin Trudeau, as he did to others. You know, he was willing to give advice to other people. We're going to see cabinet ministers file in now, but David, I'll let you make your point about what the Governor General told you about Mr. Mulroney and his legacy with Indigenous peoples.
Yeah, it was interesting. Like everything with Brian Mulroney, it was a complex legacy. I think that's safe to say. But you know, Mary Simon, an Inuk woman, heavily involved with issues involving the Arctic and the North and the Inuit. You know, she spoke about. One of Mulroney's final acts as Prime Minister was to sign the agreement for what led to the creation of Nunavut, you know, coming out of the land claim process there. Obviously, Oka happened when he was Prime Minister, which was a very difficult flashpoint you know, on the path to reconciliation for the country. But in response to that, he launched what was called at the time the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. And while that didn't necessarily get the uptake in the moment, she described it as a foundational document that provided a lot of the basis for things like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and a lot of the measures that came much later in the life of the country to respond to the need to fix that relationship. And she also told how really at an event in Leningrad, I think in 1989, when Mulroney announced what would become the beginning of the Arctic Council, she went up to him right after his speech and said, "Where do I send my resume? Because I want to do this." And she ended up in that role, you know, as an ambassador on that later in her career, and of course played a role in the failed Charlottetown negotiations, trying to get the Charlottetown Accord passed. She was an advisor there. So her career intersected with his, and in some ways his measures helped shape the opportunities that have led her to this point in her career.
Oh yeah, I wasn't sure. That is the former Governor General, Michael Jean, also there to pay her respects to the family. Justin Trudeau was writing an extensive thought in the book of condolence. He was probably doing it in both languages, both official languages, I would imagine. David Johnston and his wife now coming up, and after the former Governor Generals, I imagine we will start to see some current members of Parliament and cabinet ministers as well. One of the things I would also say about, as we talked about how Mary Simon was influenced by Mulroney and appointed by Mulroney, he did do that. He would look across the aisle and find people in the right jobs for different things. Of course, probably the most, one of the most famous examples of that would be Stephen Lewis, who of course is a member of the NDP and went on to become Mulroney's ambassador at the United Nations. And also played an important role as Brian Mulroney took a stand against apartheid in South Africa, gave a speech at the UN that became a defining moment for that, but it was also because of Stephen Lewis and his work there. So he was able to see the talent and skill in all sorts of people and put them in positions that he believed were the right ones. He also got in a lot of trouble for appointing a lot of friends in patronage appointments when he first became Prime Minister. But I would say he learned his lesson perhaps on that as time went on. I believe that is the former Prime Minister Joe Clark and his wife, Maureen McTeer. Complicated relationship with Joe Clark, to say the least. Of course, Joe Clark was the leader of the party until Brian Mulroney took over. But again, an example here of when Brian Mulroney saw how helpful Joe Clark could still be to him, went to him and said, what job do you want, basically, and appointed Joe Clark the Minister of External Affairs at the time. He then created a new ministry around intergovernmental affairs kind of thing, constitutional affairs, and Joe Clark led much of the push of the Charlottetown Accord for him. So he was able, David, I mean, I think that's one of the things that has struck me as I've been listening to people talk over the past month or so, is that he could see people's abilities, and even if he didn't always have nice things to say about Joe Clark, not always, but he could still see how keeping Joe Clark close to him would be important. I'll just take a moment as Joe Clark pays his respects and get you to weigh in. And it's not that Joe Clark was his enemy, but the expression "keep your friends close and your enemies closer," I think Brian Mulroney well understood that it was important to keep people inside the tent. And so when he took over the party, instead of casting Joe Clark aside, he put him in a place of prominence where he could use some of the skills he had as a politician.
Well, Rosie, I think that impulse goes back to some of the things we were talking about earlier of Mulroney answering the calls of a Liberal Prime Minister to come back and give advice on how to deal with Donald Trump on free trade. It's looking past whatever partisan and personal disagreements you have for what is the right thing to do and what is in the best interest of the country, right? And certainly, Joe Clark, while a rival, was a man not without skills and not without abilities.
That's right.
And you need that if a government is going to be successful, and also we clearly would have had a constituency within the party as a former Prime Minister and as a former leader, and you need to acknowledge that. And he had a cabinet of large personalities, Brian Mulroney did, right? My member of Parliament growing up was John Crosbie.
Yep.
And there were very few personalities much larger than John Crosbie in Canadian politics at his peak. And Mr. Mulroney, speaking on the day when he's lying in state, delivered one of the eulogies at John Crosbie's funeral in 2020, I believe it was, when he passed away. And it was those connections and the ability to work with people who may have been difficult because of political rivalries, for example, or just through the sheer force of their personality and their character. That's an important skill set for the Prime Minister to have. I remember him saying in his eulogy, this is the final point on John Crosbie, he said, words to the effect that any Prime Minister would be blessed to have a John Crosbie in their cabinet. but only one. Which is at once a little dig at Mr. Crosbie, but an acknowledgement of just the importance of his old cabinet colleague.
Lots of big personalities in that cabinet, that's for sure. It was a large cabinet too. I think it was 40 people the first time he named his cabinet. And there was also rumors that he always denied that he had somehow organized the putsch against Joe Clark to take over that job. There was a leadership review and Clark stepped down. But he always said, I had nothing to do with that. Joe Clark left of his own accord. Of course, after his government fell, after I want to say just over 30 days it was in power, his government fell after Conservatives hadn't been in power for so long. So it was a fairly upsetting time for the Conservative Party, and Brian Mulroney wanted to build it back. This is the Speaker of the House and the Senate who are paying their respects. We will make sure we come back for other notables, including, of course, the current Conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre. I did want to take a moment, though, to show you a bit of tape of the former Prime Minister's former official photographer, who coincidentally enough is the father of the current Prime Minister's official photographer. But he was with Brian Mulroney through many of the ups and downs of his life, illustrating that life for the family, for the nation, as all Prime Ministers do. And wanted to show you a little bit of some of his fondest memories of the Prime Minister.
My first big assignment was the Commonwealth Conference in Vancouver in 1987. It was quite imposing to walk into a room with over 100 world leaders. Being a guy from small town Newfoundland, Grand Falls, I just couldn't believe that I had free rein to walk around this conference and do what I had to do. Rita McNeil had just finished singing at that dinner, and the Mounties came in and said there was a very serious bomb threat and we had to evacuate the room. And we all evacuated in different sections and different doors. And I remember walking down through a kitchen with Rajiv Gandhi behind me and Margaret Thatcher in front of me. And eventually, within minutes, within 30 seconds, we're in this room where we're going to hold, and there's the beautiful grand piano, and Mr. Mulroney is standing over there in the corner, and he's fuming, not in anger, but he's worried that Canada is going to be embarrassed. And it's the most touching thing I think I've ever seen. Mrs. Mulroney walked over to him and reached up and grabbed his earlobe and started talking to him. And it just simply focused him totally. And it was like very much, Brian, it's going to be okay. And it truly was one of the most touching things I've ever seen. It is my favorite photo, and it's emotional. Here's a guy who's in charge of this conference, and he's worried sick that Canada's embarrassed. Very proud Canadian, as am I. And the reason is that it's always been in our bedroom since that time. Because to me it represents love and a very deep bond, which my wife and I have, and Mr. and Mrs. Mulroney did as well. For the next week, Mrs. Mulroney has asked me to document everything that they do, as I did when Mr. Mulroney was in office, and I documented his life, as did other photographers that worked for him, Andy Clark, Peter Bragg, Scott Grant. We document the sitting Prime Minister's life, both personal, Parliament, party. So Mrs. Mulroney asked me, going into this funeral Remembrance Week, would I mind photographing for the family the activities surrounding the honoring, I guess, very much so, of Mr. Mulroney. What it means the most for me is it's the perfect bookend to my time with Mr. Mulroney. When I left PMO, it was because my wife had a job in Malaysia. So to do this assignment is very touching.
Just some lovely memories there from the former Prime Minister's official photographer, Bill McCarthy. Again, his son has taken up that role for the current Prime Minister. But some of those photos are just incredible, and particularly that photo that is one of his favorites. It speaks to how long Brian Mulroney and Mila Mulroney were together. They met when she was just 18. As I was reading back on things, they were engaged within 4 months, married within 6, and have now been together for more than 50 years. Husband and wife, and obviously partners, deeply partners, political partners. These are, I believe, some of the diplomats in Ottawa now paying their respects to the family. And we know Brian Mulroney obviously played a global role as well whenever he could, putting Canada on the map, as we heard when it came to recognizing Ukraine, had ties as well to leaders in the Soviet Union, Germany, and of course South Africa. As we watch this and we wait for cabinet ministers and the current Conservative leader to step inside the room here at the John A. Macdonald building, I want to bring in Peter MacKay, former Conservative cabinet minister and leader as well, who is here with some of his reflections on this day. Mr. MacKay, nice to see you again.
To you as well, Rosie.
What are you thinking about on this day? I know we spoke to you on the day we had heard the news that Mr. Mulroney died, and I wonder what you're thinking about during this very solemn moment for his family and for the country.
Well, it is somber, and it's a reflective time, to be sure. There'll be a lot of people thinking back, as Bill just reflected on, some of those personal memories and moments of time that they spent in his presence. He was a great Canadian, a man of substance, a man of courage, certainly, and confidence politically. But really, it is those personal moments, I think, that many, and legions of people, of friends, I've run into people just here in Pictou County, Nova Scotia, where he arguably launched his political career and his entry into Parliament. And they remember when he, when he ran here and took the time to speak to people. And that was, again, a reflection of his personality. He invested in people and the country, and really wanted to see a more prosperous and opportune country for people.
And your dad, of course, Elmer MacKay, gave up his seat in Central Nova for him, and Mr. Mulroney ran in a by-election. That was the first time that he made his way into the House of Commons. Was there ever a moment where your dad said, "Why the heck am I doing this?" Or did he understand why this was important and why Mr. Mulroney needed to make his way into the House? And what do you remember about those conversations?
Yeah, it was obviously a very important time for the Progressive Conservative Party. They had briefly been in power 9 months with Joe Clark, and my father had been around Parliament for a decade at that time, and really, I think, saw in Mr. Mulroney the great potential that was obviously realized when he became leader and then Prime Minister. And so I don't think my father ever had any regrets, and he had then a tremendous proximity and friendship with Mr. Mulroney that lasted for decades, and they kept in close contact. And I know that he's feeling this loss, as are so many, and most particularly Mila and the family. She was his rock. And his kids were really the joy of his life. He spoke of them in every conversation that I had with him.
What was his, I'm sure you've had time to think about this, what was his sort of biggest political lesson or advice for you? For someone who whose own political career took many turns, including, of course, merging and creating the current Conservative Party?
Well, I think his contact and outreach, which is legendary, and that means also not being rabidly partisan, being able to, on occasion, when the facts support it, to compromise, to be able to look also just beyond the political immediacy and look over the horizon, which I think he did arguably better than any. And to also have a big vision for what Canada can be. He certainly strode like a giant on the international scene, was very comfortable in the midst of any situation, and he obviously faced big challenges, and yet he had the courage and that confidence to take them on and to see them through. And while everything didn't always turn out as he had hoped, he had that ability to bring people together. And I think that is, again, a great lesson for leaders, to find allies, to work cooperatively, and even in defeat, and even in those moments where you can't find an ability to compromise, to not hate on the person, to look at them at a personal level and look beyond just the politics.
How do you think he changed over time, Mr. McKay? It does seem to me that he, just reading back, that he mellowed, with age, that he became even friendlier to people who, Bouchard is obviously the most, Mr. Bouchard is obviously the most obvious example, but there were others too where not all of them, but some of his Irish grudges faded away, and I wonder how you think he sort of mellowed as he aged and thought about his life.
Yeah, I think as we all do, Rosie, you and I included, we obviously have the benefit of hindsight. We have the ability to perhaps look at things from a different perspective. You're no longer in the heat of the moment. And he certainly had his moments in that searing light of politics in the House of Commons, on the international stage. But I think, again, I come back to what a consequential, substantial person he was. And I think his humble beginnings in Baie-Comeau also contributed later in his life to being able to look at things, from the ground up. He never lost touch with where he came from or the people who were closest to him, but he had such a broad swath of influence and had really touched the lives of so many people that, I think in his elder years, he really valued the fact that people would come to him for advice. And he never thrust it upon anyone. He would never call to intervene, but he would call at opportune times. And he would call when people were experiencing the soaring heights and the deep valleys, as he sometimes referred to them, because he'd felt that. He'd felt those wins and losses in his life.
Maybe I'll just end on this. He was the leader of the Progressive Conservative Party, as were you. The Conservative Party has changed, obviously, over time. What is it that you think remains of the Progressive Conservative Party, and what do you think he did for the current party in terms of how it thinks of itself and what its role is in the country?
Well, politically, Brian Mulroney was a winner, and he did that through great finesse and skill and intellect. But he also did that by connecting with Canadians on issues that mattered, on policies that were important, sometimes spending great political capital for the betterment of the country, whether it was the economy, national defense. He was the last Prime Minister to get Canada to 2%. He worked his magic in the capitals of many countries, and he saw Canada as a country of enormous potential that could still be reached. And I think that may be one of the lessons for all leaders, is to really have confidence in the country and in Canadians, and work extremely hard while you're there. It's a moment in time, politics. It doesn't last. And so you want to leave a mark, you want to leave a lasting legacy that is positive. And certainly Mr. Mulroney, I believe, is now basking in the glow of a life well lived, and as a man who served the country.
Any just final thoughts for his family today, Mr. McKay?
Well, I'm obviously thinking of them, and I've remained in contact with them through this period, but going back years when they were kids, here during that first campaign in '83. I think they've spoken very eloquently. They've all really felt his love throughout their lifetime, and Mila was, as you just referenced recently, his true partner throughout that political but personal life. And so I look forward to seeing them and expressing a few private moments of condolence in Montreal this coming weekend.
Good. Well, we will see you in Montreal. Mr. McKay, thank you for making the time today. Appreciate it, sir.
Thank you, Rosie.
Okay, take care. That was Peter MacKay, of course, the former Conservative cabinet minister and former leader of the Progressive Conservative Party. We'll just show you a little bit more here. These are really diplomats, representatives of different countries who are paying their respects. This is a long receiving line until we get to the cabinet ministers and the leader of the official opposition. There's a certain protocol in terms of how things unfold here. And so we will stand by to bring you some of those other highlights. The families, they're doing what political families do, even on this difficult day, working hard to take some of these thoughts and statements from people and from countries. And that can be very tiring and taxing when you're dealing with your own emotions around something. But I know that they feel it's important, obviously, to be there to represent Brian Mulroney. David.
Yeah, two things to pick up on what Peter MacKay had to say, sort of two lessons, I think, from Brian Mulroney's legacy when you're assessing it. Talking about not being too rabidly partisan, the willingness to compromise and not seeing past the politics and seeing the person you're disagreeing with. The only time I spoke to Brian Mulroney was the day that Ed Broadbent died, and he phoned me from his hospital at your insistence, by the way.
Not my insistence. He wanted to talk.
You connected with him and said, "This guy David hosts the show now."
That's right.
And he came. He got put through, and it was a phone interview, and I certainly didn't know what the state of his health was at that point in time, but he wanted to speak about someone who was a fierce rival and opponent, but who he had tremendous respect for and thought of fondly and obviously admired, even though they fundamentally disagreed on many, many, many things. That lack of hardened partisanship, now maybe it's just time and maybe it's just nostalgia that makes it seem a little bit softer, but it does seem like it was a different time than where politics is right now. And I think that's something that maybe it would be interesting to hearken back to, perhaps, as politics becomes increasingly partisan. The other point, too, that Peter MacKay talked about is using the time you have to do consequential things. I mean, life is short, careers are shorter, your time as a Prime Minister even shorter still. And going back to what he said to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau about history will remember the big ticket items, and trying to use your time to do things of real consequence. And even things that, because there were so many that we forget about, was this official recognition of Ukraine, right? In December of 1991, Canada and Poland, officially recognized Ukraine. And this is something that on Mr. Mulroney's passing, Volodymyr Zelensky issued a statement talking about how that laid the foundation for this experiment Ukraine is now engaged in of trying to integrate itself even further with the West and free itself even further from the grips of Russian interference.
This is the vigil that is going to change out through the hours here. Now it'll, of course, be, as you can see, members of the RCMP, also Canadian Armed Forces, members of the Parliamentary Protective Service, the Canadian Air Force. And that vigil will just continue as Mr. Mulroney lies in state. Let me go now to Catherine Cullen. She is outside the John A. Macdonald building.
And here he has just offered his condolences to the family. And we were just talking, sir, about what you're reflecting on today in terms of both the man and the politician.
I'd say three things. History will be kind to our Prime Minister. First of all, was the personal qualities of kindness and caring for other people, an empathy that is very touching and is very real in the case of the Prime Minister and his wife, Mila. And that quality and others I'll mention are so important in the world today, the notion of civility, caring for others. The second was his relationship with the United States. We're quite unique, this country, with the longest undefended border around the world, and a relationship was quite unique. And I think he encouraged us as Canadians not to take that relationship for granted, but to work at it every day in the spirit of friendship, caring for another, and mutual assistance. And I think that was quite a remarkable contribution. And the third relates to that, and that is his role on the international scene. He became a trusted leader with leaders around the world, and exemplified the best of Canadian soft power, Canadian values, reliability, courage, human rights, the international rule of law, those things that make for greater, better societies and better countries. One particular instance that marked my relationship with him. In this 1989, I think I got a call from his office. Would I chair the National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy? It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and I said, well, look, I have to discuss that with the board chair and the chancellor at McGill, external activity, etc. Sorry, sir, you can't. The release is going out at 5 o'clock this afternoon. This was his action. So that was the days of the Brundtland Commission on Sustainable Development, the Rio de Janeiro Climate Summit. And he had not discussed that roundtable with the cabinet or with Lucien Bouchard, who was the minister. So we had a little time to work that through, but it was remarkable. And it was developing the notion of sustainable development, which is environmental stewardship with economic advancement in harmony. And that roundtable lasted for 2 decades for various governments. But that was Mr. Mulroney establishing that. And I think that was his mark on the world scene. And I say that we need those qualities today. They're very much missing. And we'll miss him greatly. I should say that there was some speculation sometime after he stepped down of him becoming Secretary General of the United Nations. Again, with some speculation that the Americans were supporting that. Wouldn't have history been a little different if that had happened?
Very interesting thought to leave us with. Thank you so much for your time and your reflections today, David Johnston. Thank you. Rosemary?
Catherine, thank you for that. David Johnston also had other, was attached to Mr. Mulroney in other ways. He, of course, was the person that Stephen Harper turned to set the terms of reference for the Oliphant inquiry, which was the inquiry that looked into Mr. Mulroney's business dealings with Karl-Heinz Schreiber, which he called basically the biggest regret of his life. First taking the money, second taking the money, first meeting Karl-Heinz Schreiber in the first place. But Mr. Johnston's history with Mr. Mulroney goes in all sorts of directions. But he's quite right that there was a rumor, or I think a founded rumor at one time, that Mr. Mulroney was not only interested in the job of Secretary General of the UN, but his name was being considered. Obviously, that didn't come to pass. And he went on to have, after he was Prime Minister, really an illustrious business career, working out of a law firm in Montreal. But much of his private business after politics was on the international stage. He continued to travel around the world, talking to different leaders, going to different countries, a lot of that he had built on while he was in office as Prime Minister. All right, there are still dignitaries here, diplomats paying their respects to the former Prime Minister as he lies in state here in the nation's capital until for the next couple of days. As we said, the public will be able to do that a little bit later this afternoon. I'm not sure the family will stand there for the whole day. I believe that some of them may stay all day, to be clear, but I think they'll probably go and sit down and not take greetings from everyone. And then, as we've been saying, Mr. Mulroney will be transported to Montreal, where he will lie in repose for 2 days in his home province. David? It
was interesting to hear David Johnston speak about sustainable development and just how much now, as people are talking about Brian Mulroney, that was Ido Moed, by the way, Israel's ambassador to Canada, walking in. Talking about the environment and his environmental agenda as such a core part of his legacy. And again, looking at that in where we are in this moment in politics, about 12 or 13 days away from an increase in the carbon price and the political fractures that has exposed throughout the country, with premiers lining up against it, with the opposition, obviously, the Conservatives. We're still waiting to see Pierre Poilievre here today, making it a centerpiece of their attack against this current government. But I had Catherine McKenna on the show yesterday, the former Liberal Environment Minister, talking about this issue. She is one of the many people who spoke to Brian Mulroney about it. About the how to approach this, how to apply a price on carbon, how to use the rebate to try to get political buy-in and move people along. Such an important part of any kind of transformative, policy agenda like that. And the stark difference of where the country is at this point in time and what he tried to do as Prime Minister, in the 1980s.
Yeah, and at the time, obviously not everyone was buying into the acid rain treaty at that time either, and he had to go to Ronald Reagan, his friend and colleague, and say, this is important to me. This is a litmus test of our relationship. We have to get this done. So he also used some of his own political capital to make those changes that, as you say, David, people we're not all in favor of. As we make our way through this line of diplomats representing different countries, Joe Clark, the former Prime Minister, did stop and speak to reporters after he
was developed.
after he visited the former Prime Minister. Let's listen in.
In the greater majority of cases, we did what we thought needed to be done first, and then we dealt with then we responded to the legitimate requirements of the media. Did I say that diplomatically enough?
You did your best.
Okay.
He also left a mark on the world stage. Can you talk about the international efforts?
Yes, and part of the mark was, again, as it was in Canada, a human mark. He was able to get along with people who were not always easy to get along with. He didn't kowtow to them at all, but he knew what their merits were. He made sure they knew what ours were, what his were. And he won their respect. It wasn't, it was genuine. I think it began, as all these things do, with a question, who is this new guy? But he quite quickly established personal relations with a wide range of leaders. I was doing a lot of work in the developing world at that time. And some of those people, some of those leaders were not like the ones we would encounter in except in the Commonwealth. But Brian was able to establish both links, and links based on respect, and links earning reciprocal respect with so many of them. And does that matter? I recall a G7 meeting somewhere in Europe, and there was a call that took Brian out of the room. And what it was Kenneth Kaunda, then leading the government in Zambia, who had a really major problem. And it needed the intervention of the G7. And Brian Mulroney, Prime Minister of Canada, took the call, came back in, made the request, and the G7 was able to respond to a legitimate concern that Zambia, little Zambia, had. That was characteristic of the man. He was able to strike friendships and make the best of them.
What did you say when you had the chance to approach the Cochrane, the casket?
I simply talked about the changes he made in the country and his ability to take his substantial talents and apply them with enormous consistency and discipline to trying to make the country a better place. Okay, thanks very much.
Former Prime Minister Joe Clark there sharing some of his reflections after he was inside paying tribute to his former boss, his former leader, and a man that he knew well. I'm not sure I would call them friends, but they were friendly, certainly close colleagues through many years, as Joe Clark was both his Minister of External Affairs and then led the Charlottetown Accord negotiations as the Minister of Constitutional Affairs in 1991. We're just going to stand by for more people as they make their way through this receiving line of the Mulroney family. David?
It was interesting to hear Joe Clark tell the story. Telling that story for Joe Clark there about the leader of Zambia calling Brian Mulroney because he needed the G7's help with something, an undisclosed issue. But, you know, it speaks to that sort of role Canada plays, Zambia being a Commonwealth nation, Canada being in the Commonwealth, and that being a bridge and a hinge, you know, between those institutions. And certainly was an institution that Brian Mulroney leaned on quite heavily during his push against South Africa on apartheid. So it's just an interesting insight into a little story of how it wasn't just his kids who could get him on the phone when he was at the G7. It was the leader of Zambia.
I also, of course, Canada wasn't initially in, it wasn't the G7, it was the G5. And Canada and Italy, while Brian Mulroney was Prime Minister, pushed to make their way to that table as well, to the G7 table, where so many of those conversations took place around apartheid and other important international issues. As we wait for members of cabinet, the leader of the official opposition, the leader of the NDP and the Bloc and others to make their way to the casket, I want to play you a little bit of the former Prime Minister's own words. Of course, one of the things about Mr. Mulroney was he was an incredible orator, a great person to chat with on the phone, but also someone who gave incredible speeches. In fact, the only prime minister who's given eulogies at the funerals for two American presidents, if you can believe it or not. So let's listen to a little bit of Brian Mulroney in his own words now.
Brian Mulroney
584.
And together, as Conservatives and Canadians, we're going to reconstruct that grand alliance of West and East, English and French, new Canadians and old, and we are going to make a commitment to unity, to change, to growth and prosperity that's going to mean new days and new hopes and better tomorrows for all Canadians.
The member from Central Nova has come a long way from that log cabin in Pictou County.
The Liberal candidate in Central Nova persistently referred to a candidate from Quebec who didn't live in his riding and lived in a $1 million house rent-free, and I defended you, sir, regularly. You do not have a monopoly on patriotism, and I resent the fact that your implication that only you are a Canadian.
If Canada, middle power, doesn't stand for human rights and the defense of human rights and individual liberties, what do we stand for? All I'm concerned about is making certain that Canada turns out to have been on the right side of history.
I today, sir, as a Canadian, believe genuinely in what I am doing. I believe it is right for Canada. I believe that in my own modest way, I am nation building because I believe this benefits Canada and I love Canada.
Just some of Brian Mulroney there in his own words. There was you saw him joking at one moment there. That was his first time in the House of Commons when he arrived in 1983. And if you want to see some really incredible political jousting with incredible humor, I encourage you to go find it on our website. It was from 1983, but it's Brian Mulroney and Pierre Trudeau, and it is just a quite incredible exchange and a very good roasting by both leaders of one another to give you an idea of what politics sounded like back then, but also of the skill of both those men, and Brian Mulroney, of course, very skilled at knowing when to lean in, when to have a laugh, and when to turn the knife, too. He was awfully good at that when it came to his skills inside the House of Commons. We are, as you see, at the line in state here of the former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, which will happen here in the nation's capital for 2 days. This is the official part, the dignitaries that you will see over the next little while, but it will also become open to the public for Canadians who want to pay their respects to the former Prime Minister. You can also do that. There is a virtual book of condolence that the Department of Heritage has set up. And you can also email us if you've got any thoughts about the man and the things he did for the country, things you liked, things you didn't. You can email us, ask@cbc.ca, because certainly there's enough that he did that there's a mixed bag in terms of reaction, sometimes depending on where you were in your life or depending where you lived in this country and how you responded to some of his big attempts to do big things, some successful and some not, of course. And this will really be a week of thinking about some of those moments. David.
Rosie, that person you see there, that's Riaz Sheikh. He is the South African High Commissioner to Canada.
Very good. Thank you.
We've spoken to him many times over the past couple of months because of the role South Africa is playing in siding with the Palestinians in the conflict, in the war between Israel and Hamas. They've brought the allegation of genocide to the International Court of Justice against Israel. That is being litigated right now with no shortage of controversy. But you know, it's in our conversations with High Commissioner Sheikh. He's spoken about the role that Canada played, right? And he is obviously part of the post-apartheid regime and government, but he speaks about, you know, the lessons of that struggle and that battle, of which Brian Mulroney played a key role in standing up to Margaret Thatcher and pressing other people inside the Commonwealth to push South Africa to change. And just thought it was notable that the current High Commissioner had just walked through to pay tribute to Brian Mulroney and speak to the family. And it goes back to that point that David Johnston and others were making when speaking with Catherine, and we heard from Peter MacKay, that just the role that Mulroney played on the international scene. You know, you think of him, Lester B. Pearson, some of these great prime ministers in Canadian history who had this profound international agenda. But certainly it's a centerpiece of what Brian Mulroney set out to do and some of his signature achievements during the 9 years that he was the Prime Minister of this country.
And as we've talked about, did those things around the apartheid in South Africa in spite of opposition of friends, friends like Ronald Reagan, friends like Margaret Thatcher. and was on board when it came to putting sanctions on South Africa very early on. He had a meeting with Desmond Tutu very early on, before this was really even being contemplated, and that sort of changed his views on what had to happen. And in fact, he became very committed to Africa as a continent in a way perhaps that we don't see anymore, I'm going to suggest. Also very concerned with the famine that played out there in Ethiopia, and worked very, very hard to convince Thatcher, Margaret Thatcher, that sanctions were the way forward, even as she was saying that they would be immoral. So, his role in that really can't be understated. It was significant and difficult. It was challenging for him to get others on side, and began to turn the tide, obviously, in terms of what was happening in that country. As we said, these are dignitaries just being greeted by the family there. Mila Mulroney, obviously the first, his wife.
The whole issue, though, with South Africa and the evolution of thinking and the pushing for change, it goes back to something Peter MacKay was talking about, that not being rabidly partisan, not being completely ideological, the willingness to evolve, the willingness to compromise, the willingness to change as facts and circumstances change. Yep. Free trade we talk about is really one of his signature policies, but as you've talked about, Rosie, he came kind of late to that. Yep. It's not like he went into politics in 83, 84 as an ardent free trader. It's something that he saw down the road as where he felt at the time the country needed to go. And in the same way, in confronting things like acid rain and in confronting things like, the Montreal Protocol on the ozone layer, seeing the horizon rather than just the short-term sort of political cycle of things, and pushing for that sort of long-lasting structural change, that is a difficult thing to do in modern politics, in large part because the political parties have changed. They're not the big tent sort of centrist politics that we saw in the 1980s and even into the 1990s. Certainly when Mulroney was Prime Minister and that smashing victory in 1984, the idea of something like that right now, capturing that sort of that big tent of the Canadian middle, is a difficult thing to comprehend, just because the nature of politics has changed. The micro-targeting and going after people on the edges. He competed in a different time and had to adapt to a changing reality in the 1980s.
This is a long hour here for the family to stand and take these greetings from different diplomats represented, obviously, in embassies in the nation's capital here. Once we get through this group of people, it will be cabinet and leaders of the official opposition who will come by, as well as MPs. And we know that lots of MPs have connections to the Mulroney family and to Mr. Mulroney, obviously, because he was such a fellow that liked to reach out to people, even if they weren't expecting it and they weren't asking for help. The family will do this for, I believe it's about an hour or 2 hours perhaps, and then they'll step aside and take a seat and take a moment and take a break. And then it will be members of the public who will be able to come by. As we heard from David Thurton earlier, there were some people just in town who are going to pay their respects. And I would imagine in Montreal, too, where Mr. Mulroney is lying in repose, there will be a huge turnout, as the boy from Baie-Comeau, who went on to do incredible things for that province as well, as when he was president of the iron ore, and worked really extensively on some significant labor negotiations before he became a politician in that province.
Pierre Poilievre told an interesting story in his tribute yesterday to Brian Mulroney in the House of Commons from his time as the head of the Iron Ore Company of Canada. And the way Poilievre told it yesterday, and forgive me if I'm getting some of the details wrong, but he talked about him and his wife being at a service station about a year or so ago, getting something done with their car, and somebody recognized him as the modern conservative leader, or at least a conservative politician at the time, and referenced that their father had been a friend of Brian Mulroney's, and their father had just been a miner, part of the workforce at the Iron Ore Company of Canada. And Mulroney got to know this person because he, the way you talked about the way he managed the caucus, treating them as family. He spoke to the workforce, looking for ideas, looking to find trouble spots, looking for ways to make the company more efficient and more profitable. And the person at the service station mentioned, according to what Mr. Poilievre said yesterday, that when their father passed away, Brian Mulroney called. Right? And so it was all of that, all of those same characteristics and same ingredients of the stories that we've been hearing over the past number of weeks since he passed away. That the deep personal connection during the professional relationship with people at various levels, like not just tight with cabinet, tight with backbenchers, knowing caucus, knowing political staff, and then reaching out to them at their difficult times. And it's like the story Rick Perkins, the current Conservative MP, told Catherine, right? That when his father passed away 13 months ago, Brian Mulroney, who was dealing with, the health problems that contributed to this moment we're in right now, reached out. And that's a rare thing for a person, let alone someone who was a prime minister and the leader at one point of one of the major mining companies in this country. Those stories punctuate, those moments punctuate the stories you're hearing about Brian Mulroney.
I don't think we have Rolodexes. He may have had a Rolodex, to be fair, as a man of the 80s, but it would have been impressive. Or his assistants. I always wondered how he got the phone numbers or remembered the phone numbers or how he did all of that. To go back to your point, though, about the mining employee, he appeared in front of a parliamentary committee, and that was when they were shutting down the mines in Schefferville in Quebec, and it was, they were laying off so many people, and it was the whole town really that was impacted, and it was the way he handled those layoffs and the things that the company did in order to help those people make the transition that had people take another look at him and say, oh wait, maybe he actually could be leader. Right. And then that led to his successful bid because he not only managed that issue so well and with such a fine touch, but he also was able to defend the move in front of a parliamentary committee, and that very much impressed people. But there are so many of those stories, right, that we are hearing where he somehow finds the number of your dad or your mom and he calls someone and sends well wishes, or he somehow hears that something's not going well in your life and he reaches out to call you and or something is going well and he reaches out to take a moment. And that was something that I think we've heard an awful lot about. We'll hear more about, obviously. And I think it is also what kept and keeps his family very close together. Something that people have said to me over the past number of weeks is, one person in particular said to me, they've never seen a family like this, a family that is this tight, this strong, this close-knit, this supportive of one another. And part of that was because of the way, obviously, Mila Mulroney, but obviously the way Brian Mulroney also built those relationships and helped those relationships inside his own family. Catherine Cullen is there with a Conservative guest, someone who also knew Mr. Mulroney. Catherine?
Rosemary, I've got former Conservative Cabinet Minister Michael Fortier here, and we were just talking about your reflections. You were saying Mr. Mulroney made it cool to be a Conservative in Quebec. Tell me about that.
Most definitely. I'm part of a generation of French Canadians that became conservative because of Brian Mulroney. My family has deep liberal roots, and I'm among the first that voted Conservative because of Brian. And not only that, I mean, he motivated me not just to vote Conservative, but to get involved in the party and ultimately serve in the government of Canada.
Do you remember whether it was a particular issue for you or something about his style, his approach, what it was?
It was about getting Quebec back into the Canadian fold. We had experienced these constitutional conferences and what had happened with the repatriation of the Constitution and Quebec being on the sidelines. And Brian wanted Quebec to come back into the fold. And that's really what drew me to him and to his politics. And he tried. He came very close, as you know. And for many Quebecers, those valiant efforts made a real difference.
Can you talk a bit about how he understood Quebec's place within Canada? I mean, we know the efforts he made to try to bring Quebec in, but what was the vision as you saw it?
For him, it was all about, I think, righting the wrongs of Trudeau father. And he had traveled Canada extensively as a business person. He understood Canada more than anybody I think ever had the position of leader of our party, and he was going to really attempt to take Quebec and bring it back into the Canadian family, and he was very focused on this. It was important, and he was trying to get, both culture, French Canadians and English Canadians together, and that was really important for us here in Quebec, to have someone that understood the importance of bridging those differences and trying to get Quebec back into the Constitution.
We were also talking before we started here about that this is a very personal day too, how moving it was to see the family arrive, and I just wonder, the man, Brian Mulroney, what is it that is top of most in your mind today as you head in?
Well, he was very generous. Everybody's commented on this, and it's true. When I was living in London, my wife fell very ill after one of our kids was born, and I didn't know him that well. He had just joined the law firm that I was working with at the time, and he reached out to me and offered his help, and he offered to get the British government involved and fly my wife back to Canada. I mean, little things like that. He's done this for so many people. If he found somebody that was in distress, he would try to help them, and that's something that I think a lot of people have noticed about Brian.
Former Conservative Cabinet Minister Michael Fortier, thank you for making time today.
Thank you.
Rosie?
Thank you so much for that, Catherine. Brian, as Mr. Fortier was saying, Brian Mulroney sought very hard to bring Quebec closer to Canada by trying to reconcile the issue of the Constitution, but he also worked really hard to bring the Conservative Party to Quebec, recommending to Diefenbaker and Clark and others that we've got to do more to reach out to Quebec, that there is a constituency here, as you see, successful in the case of Michael Fortier. And it was part of the reason why, even though he had a seat in Central Nova, he eventually switched to a seat in Quebec, because he felt it was important as a sign for the Conservative Party to extend support inside that province. As we were listening to Michael Fortier there, we did see David Cohen, the U.S. ambassador to Canada, paying his respects to the family, holding up the line a little bit as he was chit-chatting with some of the Mulroneys as they again stand there and hear from different dignitaries and ambassadors from around the world, paying tribute to the 18th Prime Minister of this country, and that will continue for a number of hours still.
It's interesting with the U.S. ambassador there, it reminds you of how important that U.S. relationship was for Brian Mulroney in life, but also in death of great American leaders, giving a eulogy for Ronald Reagan, giving a eulogy for George Herbert Walker Bush, and even at Nancy Reagan's funeral, reading aloud a letter that Ronald Reagan had written to Nancy Reagan. Being there in those moments, and at his funeral, of course, on Saturday, it's going to be a video tribute from James Baker, Jim Baker, the former Secretary of State in the United States. This is, I was thinking about this, Rosie, when Mr. Mulroney passed, and obviously we were getting ready for what was going to be, a state funeral and quite a significant moment. Who has to give the eulogies for the guy who was probably one of the best, deliverers of a eulogy, and as a tribute, certainly in my lifetime and memory, like he was picked to give one of the memorials for the Queen when she passed away at the ceremony that was held here in Ottawa for a lot of dignitaries and people who didn't go to the official funeral in London. His eloquence, his tenor and tone of his voice, and his ability to sort of hit the right note, it's going to be a tough act to match for people.
Yeah, and here we see the Deputy Prime Minister and members of the Cabinet now making their way up to Mr. Mulroney's casket to pay their respects. Some of the people that will be speaking at Mr. Mulroney's funeral on Saturday, his daughter Caroline will give the eulogy. The current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, will deliver a speech in the same cathedral where he eulogized his own father more than 20 years ago. Wayne Gretzky is speaking. And Jean Charest, a close family friend, close friend of Mr. Mulroney's, leader of the Conservative Party, in many ways sort of a political protege to Mr. Mulroney. He also is going to deliver a speech. He knows how to deliver a good speech, so we'll see whether he can live up to Mr. Mulroney. No pressure at all. As we watch Cabinet here sign the Book of Condolence, we want to say goodbye to viewers who might be watching us on CBC Explore. But you can continue, of course, watching us here on CBC, CBC News Network, CBC Gem. I believe we are also online, if that's the way you're watching us today. And of course, we will have special coverage of the funeral when it takes place on Saturday morning, starting at 9 a.m. Eastern. It will be a big funeral. It will be a significant moment for this country, as we are seeing just now. Cabinet ministers from Justin Trudeau's cabinet speaking with the Mulroney family as they make their way down the line. Many of them would have known Mr. Mulroney. Some of them would have had a phone call from him, perhaps giving his thoughts or advice on different things that they were doing. And after we get through cabinet, it will be the turn of the leader of the official opposition, Pierre Poilievre, who did have a chance, of course, to speak to the Mulroney family and pay tribute to the former Prime Minister when he was in the House yesterday afternoon. And I think I have with me now Bonnie Brownlee, a family friend, a very close family friend of the Mulroney family, and was assistant to Mila Mulroney for, was that fair to say? Yeah, her right-hand lady, right-hand woman for many, many years, and now, of course, one of her best friends. How are you doing on this day? Because this is a hard day for you too.
Yeah, I'm doing fine. It's been a long 3 weeks since February 29th. It's, as you know, Prime Minister Mulroney passed away suddenly from the fall. So his health had been getting weaker as time was going on. So we thought there was a little more time.
Yeah.
More time.
Yeah.
But the kids are great. They're so close to their mother and their father. They're funny. They're trying to tell great stories about their dad all day long, and then moments of tears, like it would for anyone. So
and without you'll only tell me what you want to tell me,
yes.
But obviously I don't want to be too personal, but I do wonder how your good friend Mila Mulroney is doing, because this is such a long friendship and partnership and love affair that they had, and I wonder how she is, because she's standing there incredibly doing this. And
she's very proud today to be doing this for Brian and to be with her children. They were together for married 51, so 53 years. Close, madly in love, forever. I had just seen Brian the night before. We'd been up there for dinner, and he was sharp and funny, and we had some friends with us from 1984. And he was telling war stories, and we were talking about politics and what it was like up in Baie-Comeau and Manicouagan when we were doing all the election stuff. And he was in great form. And so she's, it's so early right now because we've been busy planning the funeral, the guest list, the receptions. Like, there's been so much stuff going on. So I think in the coming weeks, she'll have time to sort of sit back and reflect a little bit and recollect her life, if you will. But their Rolodex was so incredible.
I was just joking that he must have actually had a Rolodex.
Of course he did.
Yeah, of course
he did.
It wasn't on a phone. Like, he actually had a thing.
Of course. It took the kids a few years to get him onto his phone, and he never really knew how to operate it.
Yeah.
But the global friendships that they have is really incredible, and they've heard from most of them. And they're not all famous people.
No,
they're just, they might be business people, stuff like that, but she won't be alone. She won't be alone. She's got 4 great children, this cast of grandchildren, 16.
Yeah.
And her life now has already been full and concentrated on this legacy of a family to build, the strength of a family. Brian and Mila were very aware of the care that their children needed from the day they were born, and in particular in 24 Sussex, where they really started to, I've mentioned this to people before, they never took their eyes off those kids.
Yeah.
It didn't matter if we were in Africa or San Diego. They were always in touch with those kids, and they could interrupt any call and any meeting. That's actually true.
For nothing. Like, for nothing. Didn't have to be urgent.
No. Dad.
Just, where's the peanut butter?
I'm home.
Yeah.
I'm home.
Yeah. So how are they doing? I mean, I've had a little bit of contact with them. How are they dealing with the fact that this person who was so foundational and continues to be, really, that he isn't there, or have they realized it, do you think?
I think it's coming in waves, but I would say again, they're just very proud to be representing their father.
Yeah.
And Brian had a large presence. So even though he's not here, he's in the room, and they can feel him. And again, because they are really funny boys, the three sons, they're quite funny. And they can imitate their father, and they can tell stories about him. They can talk like him. So, it's like he's never left, quite honestly, with them.
How important do you think these days are going to be? They're going to be hard days, but getting to the funeral, which, as you said, has been a lot of work, and there'll be a lot of people there.
Every day will change for them a little bit as we get closer to the saying of the true goodbye when you get to the cemetery after the service on Sundays or Saturday. So they will find strength in themselves. There's just too many of them to let anybody fail or fall. And Mila is open, so she will talk. Brian will always be part of every conversation moving forward. That will never change.
Maybe talk to me a little bit about that partnership, because she was very young when they met. She was 18, and it all happened very quickly.
And stunning.
Yes, it's still and then and now. And how did that? I know she was she was so deeply involved, and he sometimes would go to her, or she would say, "No, you got it." What was that like? Because you were there at the height of that.
Right.
What was that like? That political partnership.
Well, I've written about this, and I may do a book on it one day. But what Brian Mulroney said to me 1,000,000 times in 40 years was, "Where's Mila?" That's all he ever said to me. "Where's Mila?" And so on the campaign teams, when we were in opposition from 83 to 84, we got quite used to the "Where's Mila?" And she was a counselor. She was guidance. She was his partner. It really was. It wasn't perfect. None of our marriages are. Trust me. But I used to say to Bill Fox, my husband, "See how Brian handled that situation? That's what you should do."
Bill, who also worked for Mr. Mulroney, yeah.
No, they just had this. Mila sort of created this family and created the safe harbor for them in Montreal, and then when they got to 24 Sussex, so that the kids would be okay, and that they could live in a home of of happiness and curiosity, and they did. And it was warm. People loved coming to any of their homes, but Sussex. He loved his caucus, loved his cabinet. Tuesday nights was always getting ready for caucus. Every Wednesday, he had 4 to 8 either MPs or cabinet members to breakfast at 24 Sussex before caucus. He just kept going through all of them over and over and over again. So it didn't matter where you were, at the top of the line or the bottom.
You got there.
You got there. And he was really good about that.
That speaks to the way he managed those relationships and sustained those relationships. And you talked about his family getting to that final moment at the cemetery. There's a propulsion right now of schedule and commitments that carries you through times like this, right? When you lose someone so important as a parent, as your father, that's carrying them along here right now.
Of course. And again, it's the dignity that they want to show for their father at this point. And, we know what it's like to have hard media and bad media, right? So these are just great moments. And for people recognizing actually his record and what he did do and what he did accomplish and what he dreamed about, or, things that he tried to do for Canada.
You said earlier, Bonnie, how you felt that you had more time. And I understand from speaking to people involved with St. Francis Xavier, he was planning to go back for spring convocation and be part of that ceremony at the university where the institute that bears his name is located, and was making plans for all of these things, right?
Of course, for sure.
And I remember when we spoke to him after Ed Broadbent passed away and he was in hospital, we didn't realize at the time, how much of an effort was it for him to do that, because he wanted to do this. He wanted to pay tribute to his old rival and opponent, a man he respected very much. But, when your own health is struggling and you're in hospital at the time, that's not necessarily an easy thing to do.
He was always aware of the importance of doing things. And your enemies are your enemies, but then they're not. And he believed in communication. He believed in having relationships with people that you could talk and listen to. So you've all heard the stories. almost every leader or premier in this country has talked to Brian Mulroney on the phone, and global leaders from the Queen. I mean, you know, they had regular conversations. I mean, he was a trusted friend, and he just had this ability. I remember the first time we met President Reagan in 1984, and George Bush was there. And we were like, oh, yeah, Prime Minister, that's the VP. And he said, Bonnie, just keep your eye on him. He's one heartbeat away from being President of the United States. Like he always was aware of where we were. Mm-hmm. It wasn't all perfect, and did he make mistakes? Of course he did. Yes. But he had a real sense of occasion and what our role was and what we were doing there. He,
as I was rereading his memoir, he really didn't like the media for large periods of time. And maybe you didn't either, Bonnie. But he really, I mean, there was a period where he completely avoided the Ottawa Press Gallery. And he was very angry, I think, sometimes at the way they were influencing people's perception of him and his reputation. So I wonder what he would think now. You know, I certainly know he mellowed out at the end with the media. He was much chattier, and he got over things. But what would he think now to see all these people talking about his legacy and
oh, he'd be smiling,
wouldn't he?
He'd just be smiling, going, because, you know, after a series of things that he went through politically, which I don't want to get into today, but he had a strategy and a way forward to manage this situation. And so that part of him, I respected from day one when I first met him. You know, he would sit me down early. It was, you know, I was young. I'm from Osgood, Ontario, right? Here I am all of a sudden working with the Mulroneys, and then he becomes Prime Minister. But he said to me, you need to understand a few things. Learn about the economy. Learn about how this country runs. And if you understand economic issues, you can understand global issues. And then you can understand trade issues. And so I took it to heart, but he was just very generous and kind about, you know, here's what, if you're going to be here, you need to know this kind of stuff. You can't just, you know, we're not, you know, running around doing nothing, and you had to be aware. So I just always appreciated that willingness to share and help, right? Mentor.
I'm going to just step away from you for a moment, just because Catherine Cullen is with the former Conservative leader Erin O'Toole, who doesn't have a lot of time. So I'll go to Catherine, and then we'll come back. Catherine.
Yes, Rosie, and yes, former Conservative leader Erin O'Toole. Erin O'Toole, to start, we've been talking so much today about those phone calls that Brian Mulroney made, often when people were going through very difficult times. I know you got one of those phone calls from Brian Mulroney. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, he had served as a bit of a mentor and someone I could seek advice from as leader. But when I lost my caucus vote, amidst the convoy when the streets here were full, I put my phone away when I got back home and saw the family. It was a really tough time for us. And so I wasn't answering my phone. So Brian, not happy with that, he tracked down the cell number of my wife, Rebecca, and he called Rebecca's phone. And so I'm there sort of sitting, reflecting, having a glass of scotch, and she comes over with the phone and says, it's Brian Mulroney. And, you know, that's a sign of just tremendous character. He knew I probably needed a bit of a pep talk, a bit of a call after a tough time. And when he couldn't reach me, he reached out to Rebecca. And we cherished that because he spoke to her for a few minutes as well to see how the kids were doing, see how everyone was. And he had been through the highs and lows of politics, right? So he knows that during those lows is when the calls are more important than the highs. So we will cherish those times. And for us, the campaign event that we brought Brian and Mila out to in Quebec, somebody told me the other day it might have been his last time on the campaign hustings. That was very special at the time. You know, we knew our candidate probably wasn't going to win, but we had a great candidate. He was boosted by a former prime minister, and really, really good memories.
What did he tell you about political life for families? Because, of course, it can be very difficult for families. Is that something you ever discussed with him?
We did. In fact, you know, he said as much as possible, make sure that your family knows what's happening and can be a part of the adventure with you. Brian and Mila are an incredible couple, and we're there through the highs and lows of winning leaderships, losing leaderships, serving as prime minister. And we've always admired just how tight the Mulroney family was. Their kids are all super successful,
super close and passionate about the country. Caroline, of course, is a provincial cabinet minister. I think a couple of them have a bit of political bug, but they also know that politics can be a lot of strain. So it was we drew a lot of inspiration from them as well, just to see how tight they were as a family unit through the sort of cut and thrust of politics.
Erin O'Toole, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Rosie?
Thanks, Catherine. Thank you to you and to Mr. O'Toole. As we're watching the current leader of the Conservative Party and his wife, Anna Poilievre, speak to Mila Mulroney, big hugs and greetings all around there. Mr. Poilievre has worked very hard to connect with the Mulroney family and to connect with the former Prime Minister, to take that advice and to seek out some of their counsel as a family. That is not unimportant as the leader of the Conservative Party now, as you forge your path and make your way to an election campaign of your own. So they've developed close relationships, particularly Pierre Poilievre and Mark Mulroney, Brian Mulroney's third child. I just want to go back to Bonnie, because I know you're not going to stay here forever, Bonnie, and that's okay. I wanted to I wanted to ask you, so again, another story about Mr. Mulroney calling Erin O'Toole and reaching out to him. Who called Mr. Mulroney? Who did he get phone calls from, and who did he lean on for support, other than Mila and yourself and your husband? Who was his person or people?
I just want to say, that's my daughter in the lineup.
Where there?
That's Christiane Fox.
Oh. Right in front?
Yeah, the deputy clerk.
Well, there you go.
Yeah, so there she is.
One of the rising stars of the public service.
Yes, there you go. Everything's connected in this town. Yeah. Thank you for doing that.
Brian, well, he was very close. A lot of his friends have passed.
Yes. Yes.
But Paul Desmarais, Peter Monk,
Yeah.
those types of individuals, Pelados, the Desmarais family.
Jean Charest, I guess.
Jean Charest,
Yeah,
of course. Peter MacKay, you know, he had Luc Lavoie. There was a whole cadre of us that he would call on regularly, and then just global business people that they would have met, because, you know, they've been in Palm Beach now for 26 years. So, and they're very much integrated into the American society as well, of politicians and business people. And you would often, I would call Neil on a Sunday and say, you know, she was at dinner and, you know, Sylvester Stallone was there. Like, it was just that kind of stuff, right? Because
kind of unreal.
No,
a little bit unreal,
It is.
Yeah.
And, you know, one time I went to a book launch with her, and she said, it's just for my girlfriend, and we're at, like, Charles Schwab's house. So I'm like, oh, okay, it's great to meet you. But everyone is the same, except some people have done different things in their lives. So you could go to events and they'd be full of people from the greatest wealth to not so.
So like where he came from.
So like where he came from. So they always made life interesting. You never knew sometimes who was going to actually show up at a dinner party or where you were. I just figured out what to wear, and then I knew I could go. So, and that's what I did. But they really are quite close to, which is nice. And quite frankly, after, you know, Brian passed, and we were putting out notifications and stuff in the hospital, Pierre was one of the first tweets out. Might have been a bit of a strategy, just saying. But he did set quite a nice high bar. He set a very good tone, and out of respect, because Brian has been good to all of those leaders.
Yes.
Including the current Prime Minister.
Yes.
On free trade.
Yes, very much.
He got to know Mr. Mulroney's staff very well, from, you know, Katie Telford and Jerry Butts, that whole gang, and Christian Freeland. Like, he was very good and very impressed with all of them, and happy to offer advice.
I do want to ask you, as we watch, that's Pierre Poilievre's wife there, signing the Book of Condolence alongside Minister Champagne. Pierre Poilievre will take a moment and do the same. As we make our way through this long line of people. That's a long time for the family to be standing there. I must say, that's going to be a tiring day. But as you say, they want to do this for
and rewarding. It is rewarding.
For sure.
Like,
for sure. That does help with the grief
yeah.
process. I wanted to ask you about grudges, and
he's Irish.
Yeah, I am too. I get it. I've got my own. But in particularly the grudge that he got past, which was with Mr. Bouchard. I talked a little bit with Jean Charest about that after he died, and of course I saw them on TV talking about it. What do you think that meant to him and how did he, like, I don't know if you talked to him about how he did it, because it was quite shocking the way it unfolded for him, and not even knowing the truth until years after Mr. Bouchard had left.
So it's not my story to tell.
Sure.
But
so only tell me what you can tell me from afar.
But it was very important to him that this situation be reconciled. Yeah, very important. They were very, very close friends.
Yes. Yeah.
And as you get older and wiser in life, and you come to understand that enemies are not how you want to leave this world. And he had that type of philosophy, that you try to correct things, that whether you were the wrong one or they were. And he didn't really hold that many grudges.
Yeah.
He forgave everyone, pretty much. Well, there's a few exceptions.
There's a few.
There's a few.
I can think of
I got a list.
Yeah,
I have a list.
Yeah.
We do have an enemies list for sure. But yeah.
There's Elizabeth May, who gave a lovely speech yesterday that was so appreciated by the family.
She was fantastic.
A big hug to Mila Mulroney.
It was emotional. It was authentic. It was lovely. Yeah. It was lovely.
I thought the line she had, that he literally saved the lives of everyone on Earth, was quite the statement. Hey. when you're looking at tributes, I mean, I don't know if you can have a much better thing said about you, but I was struck by what Aaron O'Toole said, that the advice he was given on how to integrate his kids into his political career and keep them informed. Because I remember on the night when we were all sitting here, when we learned on February 29th that he'd passed, Jean Chrétien came out and spoke. And I thought the nicest thing you could say, aside from saving all life on Earth, was that he said his children can be proud of their father. And that's the sort of thing any parent wants to hear when you're passed. But that advice he gave to Aaron O'Toole about integrating your kids into your public life and keeping them aware, but also protecting them. How much of a challenge, how did they go about doing that?
It was really interesting. From day one, Mila would say, okay, we have 4 children, we have 4 birthdays, the 2 of us are 6th, then we have our wedding anniversary. Those days are sacred. So campaign people, tour, do not touch these days of the year. And we may have missed 1 or 2, but because the birthdays are celebrated in their home to this day, balloons and gifts and cakes, and it all starts at breakfast. And for the grandchildren, and so that was the beginning of the integration of them. And Mila would always say, the kids are part of the journey with us, so we have to make the ride work for them. Yeah. It's our ride. Yeah. We're bringing them along, and they managed it really well.
Especially when you consider how difficult the life is. Right? The hours, the travel, the time, the stress, the strain. And I know he had his quarrels with the media, but it's a different media ecosystem now than it was then, right? With social media and the 24-hour cycle. I just wonder if people like Aaron O'Toole have the ability to protect families, now.
Social media makes it a lot harder. Plus, we were doing very much of a grassroots strategy, so we were doing a lot more campaigning, small town buses, airplanes. It's a little bit different today, I think. I'm kind of glad I got into it before Blackberries and all that took over.
We just saw Mr. Singh and Mr. Blanchet sign the Book of Condolence, and there's lots of people. And I see other people in line there too, people that knew Mr. Mulroney, Senator Wallen, and I saw the leader of the Conservative Party in the Senate, Don Plett, and others, all paying tribute. I'm going to let you go, Bonnie, because I know you've got busy days ahead, but I wanted to ask you just what you will miss, not as a Prime Minister, not as the guy that did all these things, but as your friend. What will you miss about Mr. Mulroney?
I will miss the voice at the end of the phone. I will miss going to the house and sitting often in his bathrobe. We had a standing joke for 40 years. And if I'm to write a book, it's to be about his bathrobes, right?
Yeah.
So his genuine care for me. And because I had an issue that I had to deal with 25 years ago, and he was there every day and ever since. So and he was funny, like just funny. We cracked up, we laughed, every day. And I've heard all of his jokes at least 8,000 times.
I'm sure.
Every time he starts it, you just get ready for the laugh. Like, it was so genuine. Yeah. But I would like to say as well that I love seeing Elizabeth May be so emotional. I think it matters in life today in politics with all this ugliness and fighting and the way some of it's being dealt with. And even when we came up from Halston Playfair in the cortege up to the Sir John A, where he's lying in state, it was motorcaded, so the streets were all stopped, the police were out, there were a few people, and I was with some of the kids, and I just said, for all of those of us who've worked in politics or were part of the village here in Ottawa, this matters, because it makes public life matter, and what you do for public service, whether you are a bureaucrat or a politician or a journalist, that we're all here trying to tell stories of our country and make it better. And so I was quite appreciative of just the respect that he's been showing.
Bonnie Brownlee, thank you for coming in. I really appreciate it. I know it's a difficult time for you as well, and my condolences to you and your friend Mila and everyone. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And we are going to go out to David Thurton, who's with some people who are going to pay respect to the former Prime Minister.
Hey, Rosie, yes, we're walking along the barriers where people will be lining up, shortly after lunch. And I'm joined by the first person who was actually in line today, Gordon Pavey. He is a retired RCMP inspector, security detail for the Prime Minister.
That's right.
When did you serve the Prime Minister?
I started with him in 1989 and finished when he retired in 93.
And what was that like? I'm sure Canadians would love to hear what it was like to have such an up-close view of the Prime Minister.
Well, it's a very up-close view of the Prime Minister, yes, but we had a job to do. So we just went where he went and made sure he was safe.
And you traveled with him a lot, right?
Yes, traveled the world.
What was it like to travel with him and to spend so much time with him? What was he like? What are you remembering about him?
Oh, well, he was always very respectful of what I did, as I was of what he did. We did do a lot of talking when we had time on our own, mostly about the Senators or the Toronto Blue Jays or whatever else you might have, especially the Montreal Canadiens. We very rarely talked politics. If there was something going on in Ottawa that I was aware of by reading the news and we were in a foreign country, he would ask me what my opinion was of that. Yeah. And I would tell him, and he might not agree with me, but...
He cared that much, right?
Yes, yeah. He was always very caring of what Canadians thought.
Okay. Now, you have a message for his wife, right? That was why it was so important for you to come here and be out here early.
Yes, I was very close with Mrs. Mulroney as well. Traveled many places with her, and I just want to pass on my respects and my condolences to her and any other family members that might be here. I'm sure she'll remember me when she sees my face. She had a very good memory for that. So that's the main reason I'm here, and to pay homage to the gentleman himself who served this country for 9 years.
And you served him for so many, protecting him and keeping him safe.
Yeah, that was my job. So.
Right. Gordon, thank you so much.
No problem.
All right. So like I said, Rosie, Gordon, one of the first couple of people to be here in line. There's about a couple more showing up, but of course it's still quite early. People have until 6 p.m. tonight to be here to pay homage, to pay their respects, but they won't be able to get access to the St. John A building until about 12:30. But, you know, we're going to be talking to some more people, but I'll throw it back to you right now.
Thanks, David. Appreciate that. And another example there of Mr. Mulroney touching lives that maybe he didn't even realize how deeply he was touching some of those lives. There's Senator Pam Wallen paying her respects to Brian Mulroney, and we're seeing other members of the Senate, Peter Harder and others making their way through the receiving line with the family. This will go until about noon. And then, as David said, the public will also have a chance to make their way in once the dignitaries have passed by. I want to bring another guest now here in the studio. Arthur Milne he worked with Brian Mulroney very closely for many years on his memoir, and is also a historian, a Canadian historian. Nice to see you.
Great to see you again, Rosie.
I have to say, I'm rereading the memoir. I have been for the past. It's very long, Arthur. It's 1,000+ pages.
Well, I always say the best page is, I think it's 1163. That's where he thanks me. So I always tell everybody to read that page first. Okay.
I can't imagine what it would have been like to work with him on this, because he was such a storyteller. Yeah. So how challenging was it to try and get him to, or did he just want to talk and you just sat there and took it in?
Well, it was an interesting process because we started, for the first 2 years I hardly saw him because he sent me to the archives. So I was privileged. I was the first person, still the first person ever given unrestricted access to his files as Prime Minister and his early life.
Oh, wow.
And he wanted me, my instructions were to read, if I could, every single paper that hit his desk. And that took about 2 years, roughly.
Wow.
And boy.
That must have been juicy.
Oh, and coming from with my interests, it was political history heaven.
So he didn't put restrictions on you. He wanted you to know everything, but he put restrictions on how it was going to unfold in the book.
Well,
I guess.
it was totally his call, right? And I did the research, and then I would make suggestions. But at the end of the day, it was Brian Mulroney's book, that's for sure. And I loved every minute of it.
Yeah. Why? Was it just working with him, or?
Yeah, he was. I grew to love him, and I mean that. I mean love. And he was a character. As you've been hearing all of the last 2 weeks, he was funny. He was hardworking, extremely hardworking. Yeah. And he took this project extremely seriously. And the most important thing that we always said to each other was the most important audience hadn't been born yet. And we used to come up with this imaginary student in Saskatchewan, and that's who he tried to talk to. You know?
What he also had a keen sense of legacy, I think. He was very conscious of that through his time as Prime Minister. So what was it important in writing that book for him to make sure that he imprinted that legacy on people?
And it, all his credit, not mine. That's why it's such a primary sourced memoir. This wasn't just interviews and talking to me or a historian. He wanted the documentary record, and that's why it took 5 years. It was probably the most primary source memoir since Mr. Pearson, and before that, Sir Robert Borden. They were similarly, Mr. Borden, Sir Robert took 10 years.
Wow.
And a lesson to me, even I can't remember the name of his researcher. So, good lesson for me.
And interspersed with his journals, because obviously he took his own notes in his own journals. So you would have him speaking to you or writing about something, and then a moment in time. What did you learn about him through that process, Mr. Milne?
This might surprise some people, but his humility.
I think it would surprise some people.
Definitely. In some days, But he, most of the jokes he made were directed at himself. And if I could describe, probably my most special moment was, for the longest time, I knew these diaries existed, but because he would refer to them.
Sure.
But I couldn't read them, and it took us a while, and then
because he wanted to trust you.
I don't even know if it was that. It was very, to let somebody into your personal diary is not easy. And so I remember the day he did it. And he said, okay, Arthur, you can go to the diary. And I went down and I took it and sat in his basement. He left, and I read it. And I read it again, and I read it again. And he phoned me a few hours later, and he says, "So Arthur, have you read it?" And I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "What do you think?" And I said, "Well, I think you've just given me a glimpse of history." And it was a very important moment. And as someone who's been studying prime ministers my whole life, I felt a sort of affinity with those who had first read Mr. Pearson's diary or Sir Robert's or Mr. King's. Yeah. But thankfully, it wasn't as big as Mackenzie King's, right? So I was okay.
What did you learn from that diary that you didn't know before you got to look at it? I mean, maybe you can't share the detail, I don't know, but like, what did you learn about Brian Mulroney that you didn't know before you got that glimpse?
Here's something interesting, because I'm with two journalists. Boy, he could have had a great career as a reporter. The detail that he would take and describing the scene, it was, and I would also have read press accounts or seen videos of those moments sometimes, and that's what I used to think. And what a lot of people won't know is as a young man, and like 12, 14 years old, and when he was a boy, he was writing newspaper columns.
Really?
Oh yeah, his early life was remarkably fascinating. Yeah. And like, who else but Brian Mulroney would have brought John Diefenbaker to class when he was at law school?
Yes, he did.
And I'll never forget another moment, was opening a file, and it was a 5-page telegram when he was a student to John Diefenbaker, and he was castigating the chief, telling him,
here's how you need to be doing things. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
And it was the telegram started, "Dear Chief, as per our conversation last night." You know, that's Brian Mulroney.
Did he stay in touch with you? Did he stay in touch
of course,
with you?
yeah. I talked to him not long before he passed.
Yeah.
And I have already, I missed those calls. You never knew where they were coming. Yeah. My wife and I used to joke that when we were working on the memoirs, he seemed to always call when I was in the grocery store. I had more conversations with the 18th Prime Minister standing in the fruit section than ever. And he also, you know, and people know these stories, but they were just wonderful. He phoned my nephews, and he would help them with their projects. And a lot of students in Kingston that I knew, he would help them. And it was just...
What was, I know this is all about tributes, but what do you think was his biggest weakness?
Oh, what a good... That's a really good question.
That's a tough one, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be a flaw, but his biggest weakness, do you think?
Well,
as a leader, as a person.
Right. He gave himself some good shots in the memoirs. Yeah. I thought, in particular, that issue where a boat full of refugees from Sri Lanka arrived, and he got political, and he beat himself up over that a lot of time. And again, not news to anybody. I thought, sorry, you guys, but he thought about the press too much, right? And
he did, yeah. He thought about other people's opinions of him a lot. Yeah.
But that was part of the package, right? And I loved it. And I can tell you a funny story. He asked me to phone a reporter once. And I said, no. I said, you're going to get in trouble. And the next day, I read the paper in the hotel, and sure enough, he was in trouble. And I walked into his office, or his study the next morning, and he said, good morning, Arthur. And I said, good morning, sir. And he said, did you read the paper today? And I said, yes, there was a really interesting story. And he said, well, let that be a lesson to you. And I said, to me, right? And he looked at me, I'll never forget as long as I live. And he said, well, Arthur, happiness is working for a former prime minister who's full of crap.
Okay, I got to put you guys on standby just for a minute, because Catherine Cullen's outside there, and she's got Liz May with her. Catherine, over to you.
That's right, Rosie. Green Party leader Elizabeth May, who had a speech that really stood out yesterday in terms of the tributes to Brian Mulroney. This is obviously such a deeply felt relationship for you, Elizabeth May, and people who would not have known that you worked in the Conservative government might be quite surprised. I mean, you said it's remarkable that you two were friends. Help
Help people understand your appreciation for Brian Mulroney.
Yeah, well, I can tell you I was one of the people who was very surprised when the Minister of Environment in a Conservative government asked me to come and work as his senior policy advisor. And because I wasn't a member of the party, I was kind of I was definitely kept out of most rooms. But what I experienced was the leadership of Brian Mulroney. He charted the course for how we negotiated acid rain. And we had to negotiate separate agreements with each of the 7 eastern provinces. That then, Mulroney's strategy, which you probably heard about, was he called it the clean hands strategy. We're not going to go to the U.S. and tell them to cut their pollution in half until we can go to them and say, we've cut ours in half too. Because half of the acid rain that fell on Canada was from U.S. sources, and half of the acid rain that fell on the United States was from Canada. Inco in Ontario was the single largest point source polluter of acid rain. Anyway, between acid rain and then to the ozone work to protect the ozone layer and to ban chemicals that damage the ozone layer through an international agreement with teeth, one issue after another, I kept experiencing Mulroney's leadership. Something I thought of last night when I was trying to fall asleep and I'd forgotten. I would have said it in my speech yesterday. Mulroney in Earth Week, Environment Week of 1988, gave a speech, and I don't know where he got the statistic, but it just was so powerful. He said, that he said in his speech, the beluga whales of the St. Lawrence River that wash up dead on the shore have to have their flesh disposed of as hazardous waste because of the level of toxic chemicals. That was powerful, and that was from him, and he was the greenest prime minister, no doubt.
You also have noted that he was talking about global warming in 1988. Help us understand for the time, or perhaps not even for the time, what do you think it was that gave him that clarity of vision about the environment when it was not necessarily something that everyone was talking about the way that we are now?
Well, he was looking at the science, and he didn't for 1 minute doubt the science on climate change, by the way. Neither did Margaret Thatcher as Prime Minister in the UK. Her background was as a chemist. These were days that the myth of doubt had not yet been invented. The fossil fuel lobby hadn't put their collective heads together and figured out, like the cigarette companies, how do we come up with a way of delaying action on climate. Mulroney wouldn't have delayed action on climate. He moved. He led the conference, which was the first global international scientific conference the last week of June in '88 in Toronto. He opened that conference with a very powerful speech, and Canada played a significant role in the negotiation of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was signed in June '92 at the Rio Earth Summit. But Canada, just again, this is Mulroney personally, we were the first industrialized country to sign and ratify both of the big Rio treaties on biodiversity and climate, and we did it within the calendar year of 1992. We set a record, and we continued to set records for leadership. And I wish these weren't just historic realities. I wish we could do it again. But my relationship deepened into love and friendship because he was so kind and generous to me, because I wasn't in politics when I first worked with him. I didn't join a political party till 2006, and that he would call me and offer advice and buck me up if something was a bit of a low point. How do you explain that kind of generosity of heart and spirit to someone who wasn't of his party, but somehow we felt like family?
Lovely sentiment. Thank you so much for making time for us today, Elizabeth May.
Oh, thank you, Catherine. It's good to see you.
Rosemary.
Catherine, thank you for that. Appreciate it. We are, of course, watching the line in state of Brian Mulroney. Our coverage will end at the top of the hour, but this will continue, obviously, through the day today, tomorrow, and then line in repose in Montreal. I'm here with the assistant to his memoir, historian Arthur Milnes, who helped write him. Two things I wanted to ask you about. Apparently, he helped you meet Margaret Thatcher. Is that?
Did he ever?
Yeah.
So I was going to London on holiday, so it wasn't work at all.
Okay.
And he knew that because I had to ask for time off. So, I was in London and my phone went off.
Yeah.
And he started to say, "Did you bring a suit?" and all this, and where's your hotel, because you're not going to have a lot of time. And I was starting to get mad because I was on my holidays.
Yeah, right? Leave me alone, buddy.
So he built me up as he built it up, and then he said, "Yeah, well, you better get to your hotel, Arthur, and change." because at 2 o'clock you're having tea with Margaret Thatcher. Right?
Oh
So
my God.
off I went to the House of Lords, and it was just myself and Lady Thatcher for almost 2 hours. And I had 5 cups of tea. I remember that. They kept pouring. I think her staff liked that she had, I was talking to her. And I'll never forget the great advice she told me to pass on to Mr. Mulroney.
Yeah.
And I can't do her accent, but she looked at me and she said, "Arthur, how long has he been writing this?" And I said, "Well, at this point, it's been about 4 years, ma'am." And she looked at me and she said, "Tell him to sit his bottom on the chair and finish." That's what I did. Right? So,
Sounds about right for Margaret Thatcher.
Oh,
yeah.
yeah, it was, and she snapped at me once, which I take that as a badge of honor.
Sure.
It was quite an experience, and he also, again, purely social, arranged for my wife and I to have coffee with George Bush down in Houston, Texas, and that too was an experience, And he knew it's probably the thing I loved about Mr. Mulroney the most was he had been to the mountaintop.
Yeah.
Right, in politics and in many ways internationally. But at heart, he was still that teenager from Baie-Comeau who just loved the excitement and going to the Kremlin and all that. And he was sometimes criticized for that, but I loved it. I loved that about him.
And you are wearing something of his today, too, I think.
Oh, you've heard those rumors, yes. I'm wearing a tie that met Yeltsin and that he gave me. And one time I spilled coffee or something on my tie when I was with him. And he said, "Oh, we got to get you a new tie, Arthur, but you don't have to wear one." And he said, "Okay." And he went into his closet and pulled out a tie, and I'm wearing it today. And he said, yeah, if I remember, Arthur, that tie met Yeltsin. And I looked up some pictures, and my tie met Yeltsin. So it's a very historic tie I have.
I'll end on this, Arthur Milnes. I forgot how great it is to talk to you.
Oh.
What will you miss the most about him?
Oh, just his support of me and those phone calls.
Yeah.
Those phone calls. Christmas morning and your birthday. Love birthdays. Irish, love birthdays. And he and Mrs. Mulroney sang happy birthday to me once. So there's so many memories, but above all else, for me, whenever I see that book on the shelves, I know my history teacher dad was so proud. And Mr. Mulroney talked about my dad a lot, so that's what I miss.
Well, my condolences for the loss of your friend. And that book, it's a darn good read, Arthur. You should be very proud of it.
Well, remember page 1163.
Okay.
Start there.
I'll go back now. I'll go back.
Thank you to Arthur.
Thank you for coming in. Thank you so much for coming
Thank
in
you,
and sharing
Rosemary.
those
Thank you,
great
David.
stories. So nice to see you again. And I'm going to go back outside to Catherine Cullen with the guest.
Oh, you guys, thank you.
Rosemary, I've got Conservative Senator Denise Batters with me. Senator Batters, you were just saying that Brian Mulroney was your inspiration for getting into politics. Tell me about that.
Absolutely. From the time I was 12, I used to watch This Week in Parliament, actually, a long-standing CBC show every week, and Brian Mulroney would be there as opposition leader, grilling the Liberals in question period, and then in government standing up for the really important things that he was doing. And I was hooked, and I knew from the time I was 12 I wanted to be a senator, and Brian Mulroney is a major part of that. So in 1988, the free trade election, that was my first election, my first vote, my first political campaign. We helped Conservative MP Larry Schneider win. And then the rest is kind of history, but he was an absolute inspiration. He did really consequential things for this country, for my home province of Saskatchewan, for Ukraine, first Western government to recognize Ukraine. And so I only had the chance to meet him once. It was many years later. I was not a senator yet, but I met him in the parliamentary dining room. And it kind of took me back to being a 12-year-old kid again. I just kind of barely stammered out, I worked on your campaign in 1988, and he was just, I saw that Irish charm displayed firsthand. And but at the heart of it too, what really hit me today as I went through the Lying in State and talked to the family is, this is a family that's publicly grieving, and I know a little bit about that, and it's a very difficult thing, so public yet so private, and I really appreciate the fact that they shared this husband and father with us for so many years, with our party and with our country.
So beautiful remembrance. Thank you very much, Senator Batters.
Thank you.
Rosie?
Catherine, I appreciate that, and my thanks to Senator Batters, of course, as well. This line is continuing a little bit longer of dignitaries, members of Parliament now making their way through to greet the Mulroney family and pay tribute, of course, to the former Prime Minister. And shortly that line will start to contain Canadians who might make their way here, step out for lunch or after their time in the office. I would imagine some public servants who appreciated the work that Mr. Mulroney did in terms of his own public service for the country will come and pay tribute to the Right Honourable Brian Mulroney as well. I liked that Arthur Milnes, David, kept calling him Martin Brian Mulroney. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Because sometimes shorthand you'd call him MBM is what sometimes his friends and others called him when they were sending emails. What have you been thinking as you've been hearing some of these stories from people who considered him, may have started as people who were working with him or for him, but ended up being friends?
I'm struck by how much time Brian Mulroney spent on the phone. Like, that is a truly remarkable thing, of all the phone calls and moments where he reached out to people and connected with them. And they weren't short conversations, right? They were deep and they were meaningful. And like the story that Arthur just told, that setting up a tea with the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and a coffee with the former American president, with no incentive to do it except this person who I'm working with and I care about, this will matter to them, right? And let's make that happen. I mean, it's interesting to hear these stories of kindness when you consider how the political career of Brian Mulroney ended with his deep unpopularity. That's when I was like 20 years old in the 1993 election when Kim Campbell succeeded him. And the impression you had of a Brian Mulroney based on the public mood at the time versus the private person and the stories people tell prior to that and continuing up until his passing this year. It's an interesting contrast to get that level of intimate insight into the human being who you only know through media. Yeah. You only know, through what you saw in the House of Commons. And it rounds out the profile you have of a person that you really may only know through their public persona.
Yeah, and it speaks to something that this, I think, moment here speaks to as well, and that is the humanity of Brian Mulroney, whether it be his closeness with his family, his tight-knit family, with friends, with colleagues, and then with people he didn't even know very well, and where he felt it was important to reach out as a human, as a fellow person to that person. Catherine Cullen is outside there with another guest. Catherine.
That's right, Rosie. I'm here with Senator Peter Beam. Senator Beam, you were saying that your first interaction with Brian Mulroney was when you were a junior diplomat. Tell us about that.
That would have been in September 1989 in Costa Rica, and there was a summit for democracy in the Americas, and the Prime Minister and Mr. Clark, as Foreign Minister, they all came down along with other leaders. And there was an invitation for a dinner, and the invitation said black tie, but unfortunately the hosts changed their mind, and we moved towards business suits. This did not get through to the Canadian delegation for reasons I don't quite understand, but I didn't feel blamed. But in any event, our group, Prime Minister, showed up in a tuxedo. George Bush the elder, President, walked by and said, "Hey Brian, where are the other guys in the band?" So I apologized to Prime Minister Mulroney. I said, "I'm so sorry, sir, this should never have happened." And he said, "Peter, don't worry about it. There's one thing you should remember. You could have worn a tuxedo and joined the finest looking group in this place." So that's my memory.
That's a lovely memory. Thank you so much for your time, Senator.
Thank you very much.
Rosie.
Thanks, Catherine. It's good to have these light moments too, as the former Prime Minister lies in state. I mean, that's what Bonnie Brownlee was telling us as well, that the kids are doing an awfully good job bringing some lightness to the family and having a few laughs about their dad and some of his incredible experiences during his time as Prime Minister and his larger than life itself. David, of course, this is going to continue today, tomorrow, and really this is a week of moments for the family and for the country to think about Mr. Mulroney and his former colleagues, his friends, people that met him in passing. It's going to be an important moment, I think, too, for the country.
Yeah, I think it's good to know the history and the significance of the people who've had consequential careers in this country. And I was struck by something Elizabeth May talked about there in their interview with Catherine Cullen, that in 1992, near the end of his time in office, when his government was struggling with popularity, he was still doing big things like signing biodiversity agreements and the Rio Agreement on climate, and using the time that was there to do the things that matter, right? Because going back to something we said earlier, that political careers are short and time in the Prime Minister's office is shorter still. And you don't waste a day, you don't waste a moment if you can avoid it. And certainly when you look at consequential agreements like that being signed, in the tail end of your time in that office, speaks to the ambition of using the runway you have to do what matters to you.
Yeah. Catherine Cullen, I'll go back out to you outside the John A. Macdonald building there, where you've been doing an awfully good job grabbing people on their way in and out. Just for a final thought from you, from what you've heard from today.
Well, on top of the ambition, Rosie, that David was talking about, I think the other theme that we've seen all throughout this is kindness and human connection. And I think it's really noteworthy that is a sentiment that extended from Conservatives to Liberals, Green Party leader Elizabeth May. So that ambition to do big things for Canada and that decency, forming connections with everyone from, the President of the United States to, a warm moment with a junior diplomat, or I think most notably family in all of this. So many people talking about Brian Mulroney, showing kindness to their family, reaching out to them in some of their worst moments. I think, his was a career with high highs and low lows, but certainly there are moments that I think everyone can draw some inspiration from in all of that.
And just one last question since you're out there, Catherine. Is it MPs and others? Are you seeing people just sort of make their way in now?
Yeah, there's quite a lineup actually inside the building. And so we're seeing now, it's still some of the senators that are coming out. But yes, we're still expecting MPs, former MPs, and whatnot. And we did see the RCMP commissioner head in earlier. I know he's on the list as well for today.
Okay. Catherine Cullen, thank you so much for your help with this coverage, of course, through the day. You, of course, will be part of the special, the radio special in Montreal on Saturday. Thank you so much, Catherine.
Thank you, Rosie.
I'll bring back David now for some final thoughts too. One of the things that kind of strikes me is I don't have as many friends as Brian Mulroney, but I wonder who does, and I wonder how, to your point, how did he find the time, make the time to reach out to these people and to make people feel. And again, we heard from Bonnie Brownlee, there is an enemies list, so it's not like there's nobody. But how did he find the time to sort of maintain these relationships for so long, the ones that matter to him? Because imagine how much that phone call would matter to someone else.
Well, it's a lot of work, right? Maintaining friendships over time and over distance and over the years, and certainly at the volume and at the scale that Brian Mulroney seems to have been able to do that. When you look at all the people who speak about
There's just, I don't know who that was there, but they were just showing he was showing a photo on his phone. To Mila and Caroline.
And you've seen that, people walking up with things to show them. But just one thing that struck me about Brian Mulroney is an impact that he had actually on my life, on my family's life, back in St. John's was, and I was talking about this earlier today with Heather Hiscox, is when the Hibernia oil project was at risk of going down. The economic program, or project that really kind of put a floor under the economy of Newfoundland and Labrador after the cod fishery. Mulroney's government, him and with pressure from John Crosbie, stepped in to buy an 8.5% stake in that and helped secure that development going forward. And it created a level of prosperity.
Was that the Atlanta Accord, or that was after?
The Accord was prior to that. That was allowed for revenue sharing that allowed the Newfoundland and Labrador government to get the royalties from it. But it saved this project. And so the Accord wouldn't have mattered without the projects to generate the revenue. And as a guy who was in high school and university, when the fishery collapsed and no oil to replace it, you were worried about having to leave and going away. And my father ended up working on Hibernia and then had a career in the oil industry and moved on. There was a level of prosperity there. So when you talk about the big ticket items that he wanted to focus on, Hibernia, maybe not for the country, though it turns out to be one of the better investments the government of Canada ever made. It was a big ticket item where I'm from and had a big impact on that industry, that sector, and of the people of Newfoundland and Labrador. And that's just one example on a long list of things he did that is easy to get lost in a moment like this, but certainly had a profound effect, where I come from.
Yeah. And you will, of course, have continuing coverage on your program later on Power and Politics. Thank you, David. Appreciate it for your coverage. And David will be with me on Saturday as well, as we are in Montreal. This process here of the dignitaries and officials will continue for a little while longer here in the John A. Macdonald building as they pay their respects for the line and state of the former Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney. That will happen today. It will happen tomorrow here in the nation's capital, and then the casket with Mr. Mulroney will be transported to Montreal, the other city where he lived for so long and where they have a family home and have for many, many years. And of course, the funeral will happen on Saturday after 2 days of lying in repose in Montreal, where the public is also welcome. The state funeral for Brian Mulroney will happen on Saturday, this Saturday, at 9 a.m. Eastern is when we will start our coverage. David and I, along with lots of special guests and dignitaries and others who covered Mr. Mulroney over many, many decades. The actual funeral will start at about 11 Eastern. There'll be a procession through the streets of Montreal, that city he also loved so much and was so fond of. And we'll bring you all that coverage on Saturday. But there's obviously continuing coverage here on CBC News Network as well. I'm Rosemary Barton. Thank you so much for watching.